Catelyn Stark paused on the threshold of the inn at the crossroads and thought she felt the wind change direction. Even though the chill that ran down her spine could be attributed to the evening breeze, she could not ignore the sense that something monumental hinged on her next decision. Inside the inn, she knew Tyrion Lannister had just walked in. Part of her wanted to remain hidden, to shrink into the shadows and act on the sudden surge of righteous fury that demanded she seize him. But another, quieter voice spoke in her mind. Her father's voice telling her to weigh consequences, or perhaps the careful words of Maester Luwin urging caution. Catelyn hesitated, that warring impulse in her heart tugging at her to avenge the attempt on Bran's life, while some deeper intuition spoke of the danger that would follow if she acted rashly. No one else could hear the furious beating of her heart as she slowly withdrew back into the shadows, letting Tyrion pass by her unnoticed. She had recognized him instantly. He wore the proud Lannister colors and possessed the unmistakable face of the imp. The sight of him brought back the memory of Bran lying broken in his bed and the dagger that had nearly ended her son's life. Littlefinger had insisted that the blade belonged to Tyrion, setting her mind ablaze with suspicion. Yet in that moment, a sudden wave of doubt overcame her rage. What if Peter's words weren't true? Or what if there was more to this story than she realized? She felt the strain of too many leaps of faith. The truth was that once she took Tyrion prisoner, the entire house of Lannister would descend upon her and her family. And if Tyrion was, in fact, innocent, the repercussions of capturing a Lannister without proof would be disastrous. Her hand clutched the hilt of a knife hidden beneath her cloak, but she let it go. Instead, she pivoted around, quietly leaving the inn through the back, taking a wide circuit around the building so that she could think. In the yard behind the inn, she breathed deeply and calmed herself, ignoring the numbness in her fingers. This was a choice. She recognized the significance of it. In the back of her mind, she knew that, had she emerged and called upon her father's bannermen at that table, they would have done her bidding without question. Tyrion Lannister would have been bound and stuffed into a carriage on his way to the Eyrie. But she did not do it, and it would shape the fate of the Seven Kingdoms in ways she could never have imagined. Later that night, she lay awake in a rented bed, her mind spinning with what-ifs. She recalled how she had wanted to ride north immediately after Bran's fall, but the matter of Ned's appointment as Hand of the King had changed the path of her life. Now she had chosen caution when she had every reason to do otherwise. She tried to soothe herself by imagining a future in which House Stark and House Lannister were not at each other's throats. It was no certainty, but at least she would not have lit the match that could start a great war. Tomorrow, she would travel to King's Landing to speak to her husband, or perhaps return to Winterfell. She would decide in the morning, she told herself as she watched the moonlight filter through the tiny window of the room. Eventually, she found a restless sleep. Unbeknownst to her, Tyrion had noticed the subtle hush that had fallen over the common room upon his arrival. People always noticed a Lannister, especially one of such peculiar appearance. Yet he'd had a distinct feeling someone had been watching him closely, and by the time his eyes had swept the room, no one stood out beyond the usual suspicious glances. Still, that uncanny feeling nagged at him. When he finally retired for the night, it was with a hand resting near the belt knife he kept beneath his pillow. Tyrion had learned to trust his instincts in the dangerous game of Westeros. He, too, found uneasy sleep, lulled by the knowledge that being a dwarf and a Lannister simultaneously made him a conspicuous target. Come morning, the roads split. Catelyn decided that the best course was to continue south to King's Landing. She needed to warn Ned about everything she had discovered. The attempted murder of Bran, the dagger's supposed owner, and her suspicions of the Lannisters. But she also needed to speak with him face to face. Words in a letter could be intercepted or misconstrued. Setting out on the road with only a small escort, who were still unaware that Tyrion had been in the very same inn, she began her journey, her heart heavy but her resolve firm. She rode in tense silence much of the time. The men she had with her were loyal enough. They asked few questions. They were under the impression they were only helping their lady return to King's Landing to counsel with Lord Stark. None of them had glimpsed Tyrion in the common room. She had been alone in the back when she noticed him. Sometimes she wondered if her men would judge her for not seizing him. In their eyes, it might have been a slight upon House Stark's honor to let the imp slip away, particularly if rumors of the dagger's connection to Tyrion continued to swirl. But the disquiet in her breast told her she had made the better choice, at least for now. Meanwhile, Tyrion went about his own affairs, continuing his travels. He had no idea that Catelyn Stark had been so close or that she had suspected him in Bran's fall. As far as he was aware, the world in the north was a swirl of rumors and accusations, and if the Starks believed he was behind something nefarious, he expected them to confront him more openly, or at least to see some sign of it. But so far, everything was quiet. In fact, he'd been on his way back from the Wall, where Jon Snow's presence had both intrigued and troubled him. He found the young man's stoic acceptance of his fate as a bastard reminiscent of his own struggles with being an outcast in a family that prized looks and prowess. Tyrion had nothing but time on the road to reflect on those impressions, little realizing how close he had come to being a captive of the Starks. It took the better part of a fortnight for Catelyn to reach King's Landing. She arrived exhausted, the southern sun heating the dusty roads and making her gown cling uncomfortably to her skin. Entering the red keep through the main gates, she felt a surge of relief upon spotting men in Stark livery stationed about, some of whom recognized her instantly and guided her inside. The architecture of the place never failed to impress her, though she found it too red and too large, lacking the steadfast comfort of Winterfell's ancient stone. She only hoped that Ned would see her quickly and that she could pass along her news in private. She was shown to Ned's solar, where he sat reviewing accounts and missives. He rose the moment she entered and embraced her. Though their marriage had been one of duty, over the years they had grown to care deeply for one another, and his warm reception made her momentarily forget her many worries. "My lady," Ned said, pressing his forehead gently against hers. "Why did you not send word you were coming?" She sighed. "It was safer not to commit too much to paper, my lord husband. There is much you need to know." Swiftly, she relayed the events leading up to her arrival. How Bran had been attacked. How Peter Baelish claimed the dagger belonged to Tyrion Lannister. How she saw Tyrion at the inn but chose not to seize him. Ned listened intently, his face darkening at mention of the attempt on Bran. The name of Baelish gave him pause, but it was the part about Tyrion that made him stroke his beard in contemplation. "You had him in your grasp and you let him go?" he asked quietly, not with censure in his tone, but curiosity. "I had him, yes. He walked in as bold as you please. There were men there loyal to House Tully, men I could have called upon. But something held me back. Perhaps it was fear of retribution from House Lannister, or perhaps doubt that Tyrion himself was truly the culprit. I recall how quickly Peter offered the name. It felt almost too convenient." Ned nodded, thoughtful. "I have not known Tyrion Lannister well, but from the little I have seen, he is clever and sardonic, not rash. I would question whether he would be so foolish as to leave a blade behind that could be traced directly to him, particularly if he wished to kill Bran, unless he wanted to set himself up in the crosshairs, which I doubt. Still, the Lannisters bear watching." Catelyn lowered her gaze. "I worry about how cunning they are. My sister, Lisa, is convinced they had a hand in Jon Arryn's death. She's parted ways to the Eyrie, refusing to stay here. And if they will kill a noble like Jon Arryn, why not a boy on a bed? But I cannot be certain it is Tyrion. It could just as easily be Jaime or even Cersei." "Your caution might have saved us from war," Ned said with a tired smile. "But we must proceed carefully now. I do not trust the Lannisters. Robert, though he is my king and friend, is blind where they are concerned." The day wore on as they conferred. Ned told her of the troubles he faced in King's Landing, the king's lavish spending, the enmity of the small council, the watchful presence of Queen Cersei, and the general tension simmering beneath the surface of court life. Catelyn realized again how precarious their position truly was. In letting Tyrion go, she might have kept House Stark from moving too quickly against House Lannister, but the tension was still there, coiled like a snake. Over the next few days, Ned took Catelyn's revelations to heart. He resolved to uncover the truth about Jon Arryn's death and about the attempted murder of Bran. Quietly, he set his own investigations in motion, sometimes dispatching Jory Castle or other trusted men to gather information. He asked Catelyn to stay for a time in King's Landing. She acquiesced, though part of her yearned to return home to Bran's bedside. Maester Luwin's ravens reported that Bran still slept, but he was growing stronger and was expected to awaken soon. For now, she could focus on aiding Ned, using her Tully wits to navigate the dangerous waters of King's Landing politics. Meanwhile, Tyrion traveled southward, ignorant of how close he had come to captivity. During the journey, he pondered the strangeness of that night at the crossroads. He had told himself it was just a paranoid hunch that someone observed him. He visited minor lords and holdfasts, occasionally exchanging quips or coin for information. He was no fool. He had heard rumors of the Starks suspecting a Lannister, yet the rumors' details were nebulous. He thought perhaps it was Jaime they suspected, or even Cersei, for some wrongdoing. The idea that they might blame him for something crossed his mind, but it seemed improbable that they would direct suspicion toward the least important Lannister. What tyrant implicates the dwarf, the disfavored child? Still, the notion amused and concerned him in equal measure. By the time Tyrion arrived at King's Landing, he noticed that the temperature of court was subtly changed. He had, of course, heard from Varys in passing that Eddard Stark was rooting out secrets, employing a quiet but determined approach reminiscent of the late Jon Arryn. Tyrion also heard from his sister, the Queen, that Lord Stark was proving to be stubborn and honorable to a fault, predictable, but dangerous to the comfortable illusions the Lannisters had cultivated. Tyrion took note of all this. The king, meanwhile, was often off hunting or feasting, apparently more concerned with tournaments and the pleasures of the capital than with the precarious state of the realm. None of it surprised Tyrion. What did surprise him was when he happened to pass Catelyn Stark herself in one of the corridors of the Red Keep one afternoon. It was a fleeting glimpse. She was in conversation with one of her husband's men, perhaps Ser Roderick or Jory Castle. Tyrion couldn't quite see, but there was no mistaking her auburn hair and regal bearing. She lifted her chin slightly, and though they made eye contact, she gave him no more than a composed, distant nod, like one might give an acquaintance of ambiguous standing. Tyrion nodded in return, perplexed. That alone set him to thinking. Why was she here, rather than in Winterfell with her injured son? What business kept her so close to the seat of power? In the days that followed, Tyrion made subtle inquiries. He quickly discovered that Lady Catelyn had come bearing news of an attempt on her son's life. Moreover, there were whispers that a dagger had been involved, one that was rumored to belong to a certain Lannister. Baelish, as usual, played the part of the sly whisperer, though to Tyrion's frustration, Littlefinger's rumors were contradictory and always ended in a knowing smile. There were hints that perhaps Tyrion himself was implicated. This left Tyrion both amused and alarmed. He recognized how easily the suspicion could become an arrow aimed at his back. He thought about confronting Catelyn directly, but the court was too full of listening ears. Ned Stark, on the other hand, learned from Catelyn that Tyrion seemed calm and unthreatened, moving through the corridors with his usual wry demeanor. Ned chose not to act, but to observe. He sent a note to Tyrion requesting a private audience, couching it in polite terms about discussing crown finances, a matter that Tyrion was often well-versed in. Tyrion, intrigued, accepted. Their first meeting in Ned's solar was civil, even polite. Ned began with small talk, then turned to more pointed questions about whether Tyrion had traveled to Winterfell around the time of Bran's fall. Tyrion admitted he had not. He'd been traveling but never made an attempt to visit Winterfell, nor did he own the dagger that had been used to try to kill Bran. "You are aware," Ned said quietly, "that there are claims that the blade used on my son belonged to you." Tyrion leaned back, steepling his fingers. "I have heard such whispers. Ridiculous. I have no taste for murdering children, Lord Stark. And if I were inclined to do such a thing, why leave a weapon that can be traced back to me? I may have vices, but stupidity is not one of them." Ned's eyes flickered with the barest hint of cold anger. "You realize how serious an accusation this is?" "I do, and I realize how convenient it might be for someone else if the blame fell upon me. I wonder who provided the information that led you to my name." Ned hesitated. "My wife was told by a trusted friend that it was your dagger." Tyrion's lips curled into a sardonic smile. "A trusted friend? Might I guess that friend's name?" "Peter Baelish, perhaps. I recall losing a bet to him once upon a time and losing a small fortune besides. But I'd never wager a special dagger such as the one you speak of. There's more to this, Lord Stark." Ned studied Tyrion's face. He detected indignation, but it seemed genuine. The conversation continued, with Tyrion openly questioning who stood to gain from stirring hostility between the Starks and the Lannisters. He made mention, as delicately as possible, of how there were other ambitious players in the realm who might enjoy seeing those two great houses at each other's throats. By the time their meeting ended, Ned was no closer to absolute proof, but he felt less certain that Tyrion was the culprit. Tyrion departed with a bow and a faint smirk, leaving Ned in a swirl of new suspicions. Catelyn had not expected her husband to be so open-minded about Tyrion's potential innocence. She found herself torn between relief and lingering doubt. She was not quick to trust a Lannister, even if Tyrion was known as the Imp, overshadowed by his siblings and father. Nevertheless, she trusted Ned's judgment. If Ned believed that Tyrion might be telling the truth, she would not stand in the way of further investigation. There was still the matter of Lysa's letters and the claim that the Lannisters had murdered Jon Arryn. That weighed heavily on both their minds. Meanwhile, the rest of the court moved in its usual fractious dance. Queen Cersei watched every interaction between Ned Stark and her siblings, protective of her family's secrets. Jaime Lannister continued to exude confidence, though he kept a closer eye on Tyrion than usual, if only to ensure that his brother's sharp tongue wouldn't create problems. Littlefinger haunted the halls with a benign smile, whispering to anyone who would listen about the mysteries swirling about. Lord Varys drifted like a spider, gathering bits of information. Lords and ladies from various regions came and went, each with ambitions hidden under courtly manners. Time passed, and gradually, the rumor that Tyrion was behind the attempt on Bran Stark's life began to dissipate. Whatever Baelish had hoped to incite by pointing fingers lost momentum, mostly because Catelyn had not captured Tyrion at the Crossroads Inn. The spark had never been fanned into a blaze. Instead, it simmered and sank into the background of the rumor mill. Still, tension persisted. The question of who had truly tried to kill Bran remained unanswered. And then came the raven from Winterfell. Bran had awakened. Catelyn was near tears of joy upon reading it. That her son had finally opened his eyes provided a warmth in her chest she had not felt in ages. She told Ned immediately. As he smiled, relief etched lines across his stern features. They made the decision that she should return home, to be with Bran as he recovered. Before leaving, Catelyn visited the godswood of the Red Keep, stepping into the hush beneath the heart tree to pray for Bran's swift healing. The heart tree here was a pale reflection of the weirwoods in the north, but she sought it out anyway, needing a moment of peace. On her way out, she paused upon seeing Tyrion Lannister entering the courtyard beyond. Their eyes met. This time he offered a short bow, a gesture tinged with courtesy and a dash of his usual irony. "Lady Stark," he greeted, his tone carefully polite. "Lord Tyrion," she responded, returning a curtsy. She considered for a moment whether she should thank him for speaking plainly to Ned or apologize for the suspicion that had hovered over him. In the end, she opted for neutrality. "I trust you have found King's Landing. Interesting as always." He quirked an eyebrow. "Indeed, it never disappoints in that regard. I hear your son has awakened. May he have a swift recovery." She did not hide her slight surprise that he knew. "Thank you," she said. "I shall be returning to Winterfell to be with him. The capital can keep its intrigues, for now." Tyrion gave a faint shrug, as if to say that intrigues were the capital's lifeblood. She inclined her head, then departed, leaving him to wonder if the entire suspicion against him would fade in time, or if it might rear its head again. One never knew in Westeros, but for the moment it seemed the Starks were not his immediate foes. Catelyn journeyed north with a lighter heart. Her caravan traveled under the banner of the direwolf, making steady progress. As she rode, She reflected on the swirl of events. She was returning to her injured son. The would-be war between the Starks and the Lannisters cooled to uneasy watchfulness. Perhaps it was best for the realm that it had not come to swords just yet. The future was uncertain, but at least Winterfell would soon be in sight. When she arrived in Winterfell, the sight of the ancient castle brought tears to her eyes. The thick walls, the great keep, the smell of pine on the northern wind. These things reminded her of simpler days. She hurried to Bran's room, where she found him awake, though wan and contemplative. He did not remember the fall. He could not recall who pushed him, only that he had been climbing. Yet something in his eyes spoke of a deeper, hidden pain. She embraced him, tears streaming, and promised to stay by his side. Back in King's Landing, Ned found himself increasingly at odds with the royal court. Whispers about the legitimacy of Robert's children lingered in the back of his mind, spurred by the fact that Jon Arryn had been investigating the lineage of House Baratheon. Ned came upon the same suspicious detail that Jon had uncovered. All of Robert's bastards bore the Baratheon black hair, and yet Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen all had golden locks. Ned tried to keep his inquiries subtle, but it was challenging, and Cersei began to take notice. The seeds of a far more dangerous conflict were being sown. Even though the direct confrontation with Tyrion over Bran's assassination attempt had been diffused, the larger question of the Lannisters' hold on the throne remained. Some weeks later, King Robert declared he would go on a boar hunt, a respite from the city's pressures. He insisted Ned stay behind to handle matters of state as Hand of the King. That left Ned in a precarious position, for with Robert out of the city, the Lannisters, and particularly the Queen, would have more freedom to act. Ned, mindful of the rumor that they might have murdered Jon Arryn, heightened his guard around the Red Keep. He considered quietly sending his daughters away, but Sansa's betrothal to Joffrey complicated matters. Arya was restless, disliking the confines of court. Ned had only partial success in mitigating the dangers they faced. Tyrion, for his part, found himself in an odd position. Neither fully trusted nor fully distrusted by the Starks. He realized that if he could navigate this carefully, he might glean certain advantages. He was, however, overshadowed by his sister's quiet manipulations. Whenever Tyrion had the misfortune of being alone with Cersei, she would ask him pointed questions. "Is the Stark truly convinced you had no part in his son's murder attempt? Do you suppose Lord Stark trusts you?" He would answer with the best deflections he could muster, but he could see her mind working. She likely suspected Ned was after more significant secrets, ones that might bring down her children's claim to the throne. And Tyrion knew enough to guess at those secrets himself. However, the realm's attention soon shifted dramatically when word arrived that King Robert had suffered a grievous wound from a boar during the hunt. He was being carried back to the Red Keep with his entrails nearly spilling from his body, or so the rumors said. Tyrion learned of this development while dining with one of Littlefinger's informants in a seedy portion of King's Landing. He hurried back, uncertain how this would change the political landscape. Robert's mortal peril meant the question of succession loomed. Ned rushed to Robert's bedside. The king, pale and in great pain, named Ned as protector of the realm until Joffrey came of age. Ned, with a reluctant stroke of his conscience, penned a letter that subtly referred to Joffrey not as the rightful heir, but as the child of Robert, so the king believed. Robert was delirious, signing away with a shaky scrawl. Ned turned his mind toward how to handle the revelation of the children's parentage. He wanted to protect them from the fallout that might come if the realm learned they were the offspring of Jaime and Cersei. But he also felt duty-bound to see the rightful heir seated. He thought of Stannis, Robert's younger brother, the rightful next in line if Joffrey was illegitimate. All this tension built up like storm clouds over the capital. Meanwhile, the Lannisters acted swiftly. Jaime Lannister began to maneuver the City Watch to support them, bribing or intimidating where necessary. Cersei confronted Ned when Robert finally succumbed to his wounds. The question of power was open. In the throne room, with the king's body cooling, Cersei demanded that Ned bow to Joffrey. Ned refused, presenting Robert's final decree that named him protector. Cersei tore the decree in half and declared it worthless, turning to the gold cloaks for support. Yet there was a moment when the gold cloaks hesitated, for many still revered Ned Stark's honor and station. Into this fraught silence stepped Tyrion Lannister, of all people. Tyrion had no direct authority over the gold cloaks, but as a Lannister, he had the ear of some who had already been bribed by his house. At the same time, he had also fostered some small alliances, or at least acquaintances, among those loyal to Ned. He was no warrior, but he was a master of reading a room. And in that moment, Tyrion recognized that open bloodshed might break out. If House Stark and House Lannister fought in the throne room, chaos would ensue, giving advantage to any opportunist. Looking up at his sister, Tyrion said in a clear voice, "May I propose a more civilized approach, dear sister, rather than painting the throne room red?" He gestured with open palms, as if to calm. Lord Eddard Stark stands by the king's final words. You believe those words do not apply to Joffrey's immediate coronation. Surely we can handle this as a matter of regency and council discussion. He paused, letting his gaze flick to the men of the city watch. After all, do we truly wish to spill blood before the king's body is even cold? Cersei's eyes flashed. This is treason, Tyrion. Ned Stark seeks to deny my son his crown. Ned stood tall. I seek only to fulfill the king's command. Tyrion, in an almost casual tone, spoke to the gold cloaks. Would the king's own appointed hand be so brazen as to commit treason at this moment, in this holy place, with half the city watching? Does that seem like something Eddard Stark would do? He let that question hang. At the very least, we can escort Lord Stark and his household to their quarters under guard while the council determines the validity of the king's decree. Any man who raises arms now is the one who throws King's Landing into chaos. A hush fell, and the gold cloaks, uncertain, looked to their captain. The captain, in turn, glanced at Cersei and at Ned. Tensions soared in that silent exchange of looks. Ultimately, the city watch's captain nodded toward Ned. He ordered his men to escort Ned, but not as a prisoner to be thrown in the dungeons, rather to keep him under guard in the Tower of the Hand until the council could convene. Cersei fumed, but Tyrion gave her a pointed look, as if to say that for the moment, it was better to play along. No swords were drawn. No heads rolled on the marble floors that day. Word spread throughout the Red Keep like wildfire. Some praised Tyrion's intervention, saying he had prevented a massacre in the throne room. Others accused him of cunning manipulation. Cersei was furious with him for not seizing the moment to crush House Stark. Jaime complained that Tyrion's peacemaking was going to allow Ned Stark time to plot or escape, but Tyrion merely shrugged. One can always start a war, dear brother. It's much harder to contain one once it begins. Better to let the small council handle this with some semblance of due process. That night, Sansa and Arya Stark huddled together in their chambers, uncertain and frightened. Their father was under guard, not exactly a prisoner but certainly not free to leave. Sansa wept for Joffrey, believing him a true prince and fiancé, but now her faith wavered in the face of court politics. Arya wanted to fight anyone who threatened her father, but Ned commanded them both to remain calm and to trust in his negotiations. In Winterfell, Catelyn received word of Robert's death through a raven. She realized at once that Ned's position had become perilous. Robb, who had taken on more duties in Ned's absence, wanted to call the banners to prepare for any threat from the south. Catelyn steadied her eldest son's fervor. She told him to wait until they knew more. War might yet be avoided. She prayed she had not been mistaken in letting Tyrion go all those weeks ago. In the next few days, the small council convened in a tense meeting. Present were Cersei, Tyrion, Littlefinger, Varys, Pycelle, and a handful of lesser members. Ned Stark was not invited, but as Hand, at least in name, he sent a declaration. Renly Baratheon and Stannis Baratheon were also absent, each having his own plans for claiming the throne or forging alliances. Tyrion read Ned's statement aloud, which contended that Robert wanted Ned to serve as regent until Joffrey came of age. He also noted that the question of Joffrey's parentage had been raised by Jon Arryn and that a thorough investigation needed to be carried out. Cersei practically hissed at the table, "That is a vile slander." Littlefinger merely laced his fingers. Slander, perhaps, yet the seeds of doubt have taken root. If there is no truth to the claim, a formal investigation could clear the record. The Queen shot him an icy look. "Do you imply that my children are bastards, Lord Baelish?" "I imply nothing, Your Grace. I merely suggest that the whiff of such a rumor must be addressed publicly or it will fester." Varys bowed his head slightly. "For the stability of the realm, yes, clarity is needed. War would be disastrous." Tyrion added, "An investigation need not be a spectacle. Let us gather the genealogical records, speak with Master Mott, who has knowledge of the kings. Well, we all know he's fathered numerous bastards. Let us confirm or deny these allegations with facts rather than brandishing steel in the throne room." Cersei clenched her fists. "And while we indulge this farce, Stannis gathers ships at Dragonstone. Renly courts the Tyrells, and the realm teeters on the edge. How convenient for our enemies." Tyrion offered a mild shrug. "The truth is a shield, dear sister. If the children are truly Robert's, an investigation will show it, and the realm will unify behind Joffrey. If not, well, I doubt you want to have that conversation here." At that, Cersei rose, ending the meeting abruptly. She gave Tyrion an arch glare, outraged at her brother for daring to speak of her secrets so plainly in front of the council. But there was little she could do at that exact moment, with the eyes of the entire capital on them. The gold cloaks remained uncertain whom to side with wholeheartedly. All the while, Joffrey sulked about not being immediately crowned, confused by the swirl of conflicting declarations. He wanted to take action, but Cersei insisted he wait. The next step was to turn the tide of public opinion against Ned Stark, or else find a more cunning method to neutralize him. 2 days later, another shock rocked the city. The sudden, mysterious death of Grand Maester Pycelle. Found collapsed in his chambers, the old man apparently died of natural causes, though rumors abounded that poison or foul play might have been involved. Pycelle had been an ally of the Lannisters, at least nominally, so his death unsettled them. Tyrion suspected that it could have been orchestrated by Varys or Littlefinger to remove a potential obstacle. But with Pycelle gone, the power dynamics on the small council shifted slightly. There was also talk of Stannis sending ravens proclaiming Joffrey and his siblings as abominations born of incest. The city was in turmoil, debating the vile accusations. Ned, still under guard in the Tower of the Hand, grew uneasy. He was allowed visitors under watch, but he had few allies within the city. He wrote letters north, asking Catelyn to ready Winterfell's defenses but still urging patience. He had no desire to bring open war down on the realm. If only Robert had named a clearer successor. If only the truth about Cersei's children had been laid out sooner. Every path forward seemed to lead to bloodshed. Yet, ironically, the one crisis that had not come to pass was the direct conflict with Tyrion over Bran's attempted murder. That thread, overshadowed by the bigger question of the royal succession, was nearly forgotten by most. Then Renly Baratheon made his move. He crowned himself king with the support of the Reach. The Tyrells, hungry for influence, pledged their banners to him. The people of King's Landing found themselves with a new threat to worry about. Would Renly march upon the capital, or would he try to broker an alliance? Meanwhile, Stannis declared himself the rightful king by law, sending missives to every corner of Westeros, laying out the genealogical evidence proving Joffrey was not Robert's son. The stage was set for a multi-sided conflict. In this maelstrom, Tyrion proposed a compromise. Meeting secretly with Ned Stark under the watchful eyes of Lannister guards, he suggested that Ned might publicly call for a great council to decide the matter of succession, thus avoiding immediate open war. Ned hesitated. A great council was something that had not been seen since the Great Council of 101 AC, when the realm resolved a Targaryen succession dispute. But in the face of multiple claimants, Stannis, Renly, and possibly even supporters of the exiled Targaryen children, perhaps it was the only way to stop the realm from fracturing entirely. Tyrion offered to speak with his father, Lord Tywin, in hopes that the Lannisters might grudgingly agree to a council rather than risk a prolonged war. He reasoned that if Joffrey had any chance of maintaining power, it might be through a recognized legal body rather than an immediate civil war on all fronts. Moreover, the Lannisters had the gold to bribe or sway many lords at such a gathering. Ned mulled it over. Could Tywin Lannister be trusted to honor the outcome of such a council, if it ruled against Joffrey? Not likely. Yet the alternative was to have Joffrey crowned by force, or to let Renly and Stannis battle it out, plunging the realm into chaos. A great council, at least, offered a chance for other houses to come together and weigh in. Ned considered the North's position. If the question of Bran's attacker was overshadowed, the North still nursed suspicions, but they had no desire to engage in a war that would bleed them dry. Perhaps a council truly was the lesser evil. Word of Tyrion's proposal reached Cersei's ears. She confronted him in private, in a solar overlooking the Blackwater Bay. "You would give away our advantage? Father is mustering forces in the west, ready to move. Why call for a council and let these dogs bark at us with accusations? The Iron Throne is ours by right." Tyrion, standing on a footstool to peer out the window, replied calmly, "Is it? Or was it yours by cunning, dear sister? At least this way we have a chance to keep the throne without a siege of the city. If the entire realm turns against us, Father's armies won't suffice to hold the capital forever. We can't fight the Tyrells, the Baratheons, and possibly the North at once." "What of the Starks?" she spat. "They're only quiet because Lord Eddard is under guard. If we let him out, he'll ride back north and come at us with all the bannermen of Winterfell. An outcome that would be more certain if we behead him or keep him a prisoner indefinitely," Tyrion said. "The North does not forget, sister. At least this way, if Ned Stark believes we're acting in good faith, he might hold his banners back." Cersei's lip curled. "Good faith? How naive you've become." Tyrion gave a small shrug. "Naivete? Or a recognition that the best battles are those avoided? War is costly, and with Stannis so stubborn and Renly so popular, we're not exactly in a comfortable position." He turned his mismatched eyes to her. "In the end, we need a solution that secures the throne without draining our resources. Let the council gather. Let the lords squabble. Let us do what we Lannisters do best. Maneuver behind the scenes to maintain our advantage." Cersei pressed her lips together, scanning his face, searching for some sign of duplicity. She found only the sly cunning that was always there. Though she hated the idea, she recognized the sense in it. So she grudgingly gave her blessing. "Very well, but if Eddard Stark steps out of line even once, I will have his head." Thus, word spread throughout the realm that a great council would be convened in King's Landing to discuss the line of succession in light of Renly's and Stannis' claims, as well as any other claimants. Ned was provisionally released from guarded confinement, allowed to move about the capital so long as he agreed not to flee or call his banners. He was forced to give his word, which, being Eddard Stark, he would not break lightly. The gold cloaks watched his every move, and Tyrion often appeared at Ned's side with a friendly yet watchful demeanor. The city prepared for the arrival of lords, ladies, and knights from all corners of the Seven Kingdoms. The Tyrells, with Renly at their head, came in force. Stannis, from Dragonstone, arrived with a modest retinue, though his reputation as a stern, iron-willed commander lent him weight. Representatives from the Vale, the Riverlands, the Westerlands, the Reach, the North, and Dorne began to converge. The small folk looked on in wonder or dread. Gossip spread like wildfire. Who would be crowned? Would there be violence? Ned took the opportunity to write Catelyn, urging her to remain in Winterfell for the time being, to keep the North secure in case events turned ugly. Robb was eager to march, but Catelyn, heeding Ned's request, kept the young wolf's ambitions in check. She reminded him that if war broke out, the entire realm would suffer. For now, they would see if Ned could shape the council into something that avoided bloodshed. When the great lords finally gathered in the Red Keep's throne room, the tension was palpable. Joffrey sat uncomfortably upon the Iron Throne, dwarfed by the swords. Cersei stood by his side, regal and cold. Stannis took a position near the front, posture rigid, making no attempt to hide his contempt for what he considered an illegitimate boy king. Renly, bedecked in green and gold, was all charm. A Tyrell rose pinned next to his stag sigil. Ned Stark stood with a handful of Northmen, his face grim. Tyrion was not seated with them. Instead, he remained near his family's dais, ironically acting as an intermediary. The rest of the high seats were filled with notables from across the realm. The small council presided, or what was left of it, with various new appointees to replace Pycelle. Grand Maester Arwen, a man sent from the Citadel, took Pycelle's place. The white-cloaked Kingsguard loomed around the dais. Jaime Lannister was nowhere to be seen. Still in the field, some said, or patrolling the city. Littlefinger lingered on the outskirts, watching with a cunning smile. The herald announced that this great council would hear the claims of any who sought the Iron Throne and decide upon the rightful king. Joffrey's name was introduced first. Cersei spoke of Robert's will and Joffrey's undeniable heritage. Stannis responded by stepping forward and proclaiming that Joffrey and his siblings were born of incest between Cersei and Jaime Lannister, presenting genealogical records and the testimonies of certain individuals who had knowledge of the children's parentage. A hush fell, broken by murmurs of shock, outrage, or disbelief. Cersei, eyes blazing, denounced Stannis as a liar. Renly then offered a compromise. Even if Joffrey was legitimate, he was a boy unfit to rule, and the realm needed a strong king. He boasted of his own popularity and claimed many lords of the South stood behind him. Ned Stark was asked to speak. Reluctantly, he confirmed that Jon Arryn had suspected the parentage issue, and that he himself had noticed certain details consistent with Stannis's claims. He did not relish speaking publicly, but truth as truth. If Joffrey was not Robert's son, the rightful heir was Robert's oldest brother, Stannis. In that moment, the entire throne room seemed poised on the brink of chaos. Cersei hissed for the gold cloaks to seize Ned Stark for treason, but Tyrion stepped forward. "He is merely stating what many believe to be fact," Tyrion said. "If he is wrong, let us see incontrovertible proof. If he is right, let us consider the ramifications. This great council must settle the matter." Cersei had half a mind to scream for Tyrion's arrest as well, but she knew that might turn the city watch against her, or at least fracture its loyalties. Tension thrummed like a drawn bowstring. The lords in attendance looked from one face to another. The accusations hovered in the air. A single command could spill blood. Tywin Lannister, in all his stern glory, was not present. He was said to be in the field, leading Lannister forces. But he had dispatched letters urging caution and supporting Joffrey, though not wholeheartedly acknowledging the incest charge. As the day wore on, arguments flared on both sides, until the sun began to dip below the horizon. The tension remained unbroken. The Great Council was adjourned until the following day, with no resolution. Outside the throne room, duels nearly broke out among hot-headed knights in the corridors. Ned retreated to his chambers, Sansa and Arya close by. Renly and the Tyrells feasted privately in the city, hoping to sway more lords to their side. Stannis retired to a small manse, unflinching in his conviction that the throne was his by right. Joffrey, fuming, demanded that Cersei allow him to punish these traitors who doubted him. She could only counsel patience, though every instinct urged her to lash out. Tyrion found himself in the improbable role of mediator, trying to prevent a meltdown that would surely ignite civil war. Littlefinger, slipping through the halls, whispered in passing to Varys, "What a grand spectacle! Let them dance. I'll play the music." Varys only offered a cryptic smile. On the second day of the Great Council, a new piece of evidence was presented. A written confession from Ser Hugh of the Vale, a young knight who had once served Jon Arryn. In it, he claimed that prior to Jon Arryn's death, the Hand had confronted Queen Cersei with suspicions about her children's parentage. He further claimed that Jon Arryn planned to present these suspicions to King Robert, prompting the Queen to fear that Robert would name Stannis as heir. The authenticity of this confession was questionable, but it inflamed the gathered lords even more. Cersei denied everything, calling it a forgery or the ravings of a frightened boy, but the damage was done. Fissures cracked among the assembled lords. Some began to pivot toward Stannis, seeing Joffrey's legitimacy as too questionable. Others, who preferred a charismatic figure, leaned toward Renly. A smaller faction hesitated, worried that discarding Joffrey would set a dangerous precedent. Tyrion stood by, trying to salvage House Lannister's position by emphasizing that the realm needed stability, and if some resolution could keep Joffrey on the throne with careful oversight, it might still be better than a multi-king war. But day by day, the cracks widened. In Winterfell, Catelyn read the Raven's messages with growing dread. She had made a decision at the crossroads in that prevented a direct feud with Tyrion Lannister over Bran's attempted murder. But now the realm faced something far larger. A contested throne, multiple kings, and potential civil war. She prayed to the old gods to watch over Ned. She prayed for her family, for Sansa and Arya in King's Landing, for Robb preparing for any eventuality, for Bran still recovering, for Rickon too young to understand. She prayed her choice to spare Tyrion had not merely delayed a worse conflict. A third day came and went in the Great Council with no resolution. Men wrangled over lines of succession, demanded more proof, invoked old precedents. Cersei threatened to leave the council and declare Joffrey king by force. Stannis threatened to lay siege to King's Landing if the council did not confirm his claim. Renly threatened to withdraw with the Tyrells and starve the capital of Feud. Tyrion tried in vain to push for further negotiation. Ned quietly insisted on the letter of the law. At last, on the fourth day, tensions snapped. A band of gold cloaks loyal to Joffrey arrested one of Stannis' envoys inside the Red Keep, accusing him of espionage. Word reached Stannis, who immediately demanded the envoy's release. When it was not granted, he took it as a violation of the council's neutrality. In response, he withdrew from the city with his retinue, returning to his fleet. Renly, seeing an opportunity, tried to intercept Stannis for negotiations, but the older brother refused to yield. Fearing an imminent siege, many lords left King's Landing. The Great Council, meant to unite the realm, collapsed into disarray. Ned, recognizing that the city might become a war zone, begged Cersei to let his daughters depart. Tyrion supported Ned's request, knowing that harming the Stark girls would only enrage the North. Cersei, wanting to keep them as potential hostages, refused at first. But Tyrion, leveraging some knowledge of the City Watch's uncertain loyalty, convinced her that releasing the girls might buy Ned's continued cooperation, or at least prevent House Stark from retaliating too quickly. So Sansa and Arya were permitted to leave. Ned, however, was held to his oath to remain. He escorted his daughters to the city gates, promising them that he would resolve the matter soon and join them in Winterfell. He urged them to ride under heavy guard and to trust only those sworn to House Stark. Tearfully, they parted ways. Soon after, news came that Stannis had blockaded the Blackwater Bay with a portion of his fleet, while Renly gathered a larger force of Tyrell and Stormlands soldiers south of the city. King's Landing braced for war from two directions. Jaime Lannister returned with a host from Casterly Rock, fortifying the western roads. The North had not yet mobilized in full, waiting on Ned's word. But trouble brewed in the Riverlands, as Tywin's bannermen skirmished with some of the Tully's men over unsettled debts. Violence flared in scattered pockets across the realm. The War of the Five Kings, or perhaps the War of the Three Kings thus far, appeared inevitable. On one fateful evening, as the City Watch braced for a possible assault by Stannis' fleet, Tyrion found Ned Stark alone, gazing across the torchlit walls of the Red Keep. Seabirds wheeled overhead, and the tang of salt air drifted in from the bay. Ned's normally stoic face was etched with sorrow. Tyrion approached quietly, his footsteps echoing on the stone rampart. "Lord Stark," Tyrion said, his voice subdued, "I see we stand on the precipice." Ned turned, regarding him. "Yes, you tried to stop this, but it seems unstoppable." Tyrion exhaled. "I'm not a warrior. I can't hold back armies. But I had hoped that a little cunning and some words might persuade the realm to avoid open war." He glanced at the flicker of the torches along the city walls. "It's ironic," The conflict you and my family nearly had over that dagger was so much smaller than what looms now. Ned nodded. I wonder, if my lady wife had seized you at the Crossroads Inn, would we have come to this sooner? Perhaps war was always coming, with or without that. The question of the children's parentage is a far deeper wound. Tyrion huffed a soft laugh. Perhaps your wife's forbearance gave us more time to see sense. Pity we seem to have squandered it. They stood in silence for a moment, two men of vastly different lives, brought together by the swirl of events. Beneath them, guards paced the battlements. Beyond the walls, the city sprawled in darkness and candlelight, a million souls unknowingly balanced on the blade's edge of war. At last, Ned spoke. Why do you do this, Lord Tyrion? He asked, not unkindly. Why go against your sister's instincts for a swift and bloody conclusion? You're a Lannister, after all. Tyrion's lips curved in a sad smile. I am a Lannister, yes, but even I know that once the dice of war are cast, the realm will pay dearly. And for what? An incestuous boy's right to wear a crown? The ambitions of lords who name themselves king because they can? I prefer the safety of libraries, the comfort of a good vintage, and the delight of a sharp conversation. Let the realm tear itself apart, they say. But in that chaos, so many innocents suffer. He swallowed. I might be cunning, but I'm not heartless, and I have no desire to see King's Landing sacked or the small folk starve. Ned studied him a moment longer. You speak sense. If only more did. Tyrion stared at the sea. If only. Neither man could divine what might come next. Beyond the horizon lay the uncertain future. Ships churned the waters of the bay. Scouts reported that Stannis' fleet was massed, though not yet attacking. Rumors claimed Renly was marching north, while Tywin arrayed forces to block him. The Vale remained quiet, its Lady Lisa turning inward. The north waited. Dorne remained aloof as it often did, observing from afar, perhaps biding its time to strike old grudges. One spark would set the Seven Kingdoms aflame. But whatever happened now, the feud that might have started with the abduction of Tyrion Lannister had been averted. The dagger's role became only a footnote amid the far grander conflict of succession. And though House Stark still harbored mistrust for the Lannisters, the same hatred did not burn as hotly as it might have had Tyrion been seized, imprisoned, and accused. Instead, they found themselves reluctant partners in a last-ditch effort to keep the realm from total catastrophe, each tethered by the tenuous thread of mutual necessity. And so the stage was set for the war that would determine the fate of Westeros, shaped in large part by a single choice at an inn on the crossroads of the realm. Had Catelyn Stark seized Tyrion Lannister that day, the entire tapestry of events would have rippled in a different pattern. Yet even with that crisis averted, the realm faced a greater threat born not of a dagger, but of a secret that undermined the legitimacy of the Iron Throne. The intrigues in King's Landing, the ambitions of would-be kings, and the deep-seated mistrust among the great houses meant that the land would soon know blood and fire regardless. Peace might have been possible, but the gears of power had already turned too far. On the ramparts, Ned Stark and Tyrion Lannister lingered a while longer, two men of cautious principle and cunning, respectively, watching as dark clouds gathered over Blackwater Bay. When lightning flashed in the distance, it illuminated the tense lines on their faces. Thunder rolled a few moments later. Tyrion exhaled, turning away with a final glance at Ned, and trudged down the steps, the flicker of torches dancing across his small form. Ned remained, clasping his hands behind his back, gaze fixed upon the swirling sky, wondering if the gods had any mercy left for the Seven Kingdoms. In the following days, the catapults were readied upon the walls, and barrels of wildfire were placed strategically under the watch of the Alchemists' Guild, a measure championed by Tyrion in case Stannis launched an attack on the riverfront. Spies whispered of Renly's approach, uncertain if he would try a direct assault or a negotiated entry. The city's small folk whispered of a prophesied Targaryen returning from across the sea, though no official confirmation had come of that. Every rumor added another tremor to the uneasy ground beneath King's Landing. Cersei withdrew more and more into private councils, speaking mainly to Jaime and a handful of loyal advisors, all while Joffrey paraded through the streets, demanding the respect of a rightful king. The boy's cruelty surfaced in occasional outbursts, which only worsened public sentiment. Had the Great Council continued unimpeded, perhaps an official verdict would have recognized Stannis or forced a compromise. Now everything hung in the balance. A standoff around the capital, with thousands of lives bracing for the storm. Far to the north, Catelyn read the Ravens daily, some from Ned, some from distant lords or from the spymaster's web, each painting a more dire picture. She roamed the halls of Winterfell, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness left by Ned's absence. Robb grew restless, longing to march south. Bran, still unable to walk, gazed out at the courtyard from his window, feeling the restlessness of his own caged spirit. They all knew that if the capital descended into chaos, the armies of the north might be forced to intervene. But for now they waited. They waited for some sign that Ned could bring about a peaceful resolution. Even so, no resolution came. Instead, in the dead of night, scouts brought word that Stannis had begun moving part of his fleet up the Blackwater rush, perhaps testing the city's defenses. Another rumor claimed that Renly had seized Bitterbridge and was marching toward King's Landing with a host that far outnumbered what remained of the city watch. The Lannisters, for their part, had called upon Tywin to bring his field army back east, though that might leave Casterly Rock vulnerable to any opportunistic house. The realm was dividing along fault lines, each faction jockeying for position. Weeks passed in a tense standoff. Joffrey continued to claim the throne from within King's Landing, but outside its walls, 2 Baratheon brothers declared themselves kings, and the rest of the realm splintered. Every passing day threatened open hostilities. And in the background, there were still quiet conspiracies swirling. Varys' secret conversation with Illyrio Mopatis regarding Targaryen exiles, Littlefinger's potential betrayals, the silent watchers from Dorne waiting for an opportune moment. The tapestry was enormous, and every thread pulled in a different direction. Ultimately, the war did break out, though not in the form of a single cataclysmic battle outside the walls. Instead, it began with smaller engagements, alliances, and betrayals. Stannis, refusing to be overshadowed by Renly, made a bold attempt to storm King's Landing from the bay, leading to a brutal clash on the Blackwater. Tyrion, forced into the role of defender, unleashed wildfire on the attacking ships, setting the river aflame in green devastation. Hundreds died in the inferno. The City Watch fought desperately on the walls. Ned, bound by his word not to desert, helped rally defensive measures, trying in vain to spare as many lives as possible. In the aftermath, Stannis' forces reeled, battered, yet not entirely broken. Renly approached from the south soon after, his Tyrell allies fresh and numerous. Jaime Lannister arrived with part of Tywin's army from the west. The city hovered on the brink of a three-way confrontation. Within King's Landing, starvation threatened as supply lines were cut. Riots broke out in Flea Bottom, the people blaming the crown for the war. Ned watched it unfold in mounting horror. The realm he had tried to protect was drowning in blood and ambition. Catelyn, upon hearing the news of the wildfire and the carnage, felt her heart sink. Robb and his bannermen demanded they march south, to rescue Ned or to negotiate terms from a position of strength. Torn between her love for her husband and her fear for the North, Catelyn reluctantly agreed. The banners were called, and the armies of the North began to assemble. War, after so many delays, had truly come. The boy of Winterfell, who had once dreamed of adventure, now marched to a southern war that threatened to devour them all. And still, after all that, the question of Bran's would-be killer remained unsolved. Bran himself, haunted by strange dreams of a three-eyed crow, could only recall a flash of golden hair at the moment he fell. The Lannisters, Jaime and Cersei, remained prime suspects, but the impetus for that murder attempt seemed a smaller puzzle compared to the gaping chaos that had consumed the realm. Yet in quiet moments, Bran wondered who had wanted him dead so badly. He would find no answer in a land consumed by kings and crowns. In King's Landing, Tyrion continued to navigate the precarious politics, preventing Cersei and Joffrey from committing too many atrocities. But with every passing day, the body count grew, and the city's resources dwindled. The seeds of war had taken root in a deeper soil than any single dagger could have provided. Even though Catelyn had spared Tyrion, even though a direct Stark-Lannister blood feud had been delayed, the realm's deeper wounds bled freely, forming rivers of conflict. Ned Stark tried to mitigate the suffering, but as forces converged on kings landing from all sides, he feared it was too late. One evening, in the midst of these trials, Tyrion found Ned in the Tower of the Hand's study. Candlelight flickered over maps spread out on a table, each annotated with troop movements and supply lines. Ned looked up as Tyrion entered, then returned to his notes. "You see," Ned said quietly, not looking up again. "War was coming, no matter what we did." Tyrion approached, arms folded. "I see it all too clearly. If my wife had seized you at the inn, the war might have erupted under different pretexts, perhaps even sooner. But now, here we are, no further from the precipice. The realm burns for crowns." Tyrion studied the battered man before him. "In this war, no one truly wins. The lords will tear each other apart, and in the end, the people pay the price." Ned nodded in weary agreement. "I only hope it ends quickly." Their conversation lapsed into silence. Papers rustled in the breeze from the arrow slit. Outside, the city moaned with the pangs of hunger and fear. Each of them harbored their own regrets. Tyrion regretted that diplomacy had failed. Ned regretted that his honor bound him to a crown no longer guided by Robert's hand. Neither was sure if the conflict could be ended short of a decisive, terrible confrontation. Perhaps if Stannis overcame the city's defenses swiftly, the war would be concluded with fewer casualties. Or perhaps Renly would outmaneuver them all. Maybe Tywin Lannister's unstoppable will would crush the Baratheon forces, securing Joffrey on the throne. No one could see the shape of victory in the chaos. They only knew that the peaceful days were gone. Far away in Winterfell, Catelyn's mind drifted back to that moment at the Crossroads Inn. Her decision to let Tyrion slip by, her sense that seizing him would have ignited a conflict that might consume her family. Now, with the realm at war anyway, she questioned whether she had merely delayed the inevitable. Yet she would never know if things might have been worse had she taken Tyrion captive. All she could do was brace for the future, strengthen her family's position, and pray that the gods had not abandoned them. And so Westeros descended into a war of crowns, shaped by many twists, many broken oaths, and many cunning schemes. The attempted murder of Bran Stark, once a focal point of blame upon Tyrion Lannister, faded into the background of the realm's greater unrest. The blood of kings and the pride of great lords overshadowed all else. Yet in small ways, Catelyn Stark's single choice that day at the Crossroads did indeed ripple outward. Tyrion's role in preventing immediate bloodshed in the throne room, his counsel that led to the attempt at a great council. All these things delayed the worst of the violence, bought time for negotiations that, while ultimately unsuccessful, saved countless lives in the shore. T-term. Some in the city recognized that fact, though few would ever speak of it openly. In the end, what might have been a straightforward war between two mighty houses turned into a labyrinth of competing claims, alliances, and betrayals. The final shape of the realm would be determined not by a single dagger, but by the hearts of those who contended for the Iron Throne. And in that swirling storm of ambition, betrayal, and honor, one small truth shone like a distant star. All conflicts are the sum of countless choices, both grand and minute. If Catelyn Stark had never captured Tyrion Lannister, she might have saved the North and the Westerlands from an immediate, bloody feud. But even the wisest choices cannot always stave off the storms that gather across a realm poised on the knife's edge of ruin. She had spared the imp, and as a result, a measure of caution and diplomacy had tempered the realm's slide into war. Yet it slid all the same. The lines were drawn. The storms were gathering. Kings in the south, lords in the west, a watchful north, a hidden Targaryen threat across the sea. Each piece moved across a board older and more vast than any single family's enmities. But for that fleeting moment, under candlelit corridors or on castle battlements, Eddard Stark and Tyrion Lannister found themselves on the same side of reason, struggling to keep the realm from devouring itself. In the end, war's maw yawned wide, pulling them all in. And so, the battle horns sounded. The ravens flew, swords were drawn, and the 7 kingdoms wept. Yet, like a whispered refrain, a thought lingered in the hearts of those who remembered that fateful choice at the crossroads in, what if violence, once kindled, can be tempered by a single act of restraint? What if the flicker of mercy can, if only briefly, stay the hand of death? In a land where might so often makes right, and cunning so often outstrips compassion, that small act of mercy was a candle in the dark. It was not enough to banish the shadows of war that would come, but it shone nonetheless, a testament to the possibility that not all conflicts must begin with bloodshed. And for that alone, perhaps the realm owed Catelyn Stark its gratitude, even as it marched unheeding into the flames of its own making. A grim morning light settled over King's Landing, dulling the sharp edges of broken towers and spires. Flecks of ash drifted on the wind, remnants of the wildfire that had scorched part of the Blackwater during Stannis' first foray upriver. The flames had died away, leaving charred hulks of ships and scorched embankments behind. The city still stood, but the scars were fresh, and the smell of burned wood and flesh lingered in the humid air. Eddard Stark rubbed his bleary eyes as he stepped onto the outer ramparts of the Red Keep. Rough nights had become his new existence. Nights full of urgent councils, hurried planning, and the weary sorrow of a man bound by honor to a war he never wanted. His hair had more silver in it now, or so his reflection told him whenever he chanced to pass a polished surface. But the reflection that haunted him most was that of the realm itself, fracturing under a war that grew more complicated by the day. He gazed over the city. It was morning, but the residents of Flea Bottom and the ramshackle districts near the walls were still stirring from fitful, hungry slumber. Rations had grown thin. The gold cloaks patrolled with sullen, watchful eyes, every man aware how close the city was to breaking into open riot. Ned took no joy in ordering them about. He knew the small folk saw the guards as enforcers of a half-accepted king rather than protectors of peace. Sighing, Ned turned back toward the Tower of the Hand. The main keep of the Red Keep lay across a connecting wall. Inside it, Joffrey Baratheon insisted upon calling himself king, if only to quell any show of doubt. The boy's arrogance had only increased after surviving Stannis' initial assault, and the tension between Ned and Cersei Lannister was a constant hazard. Halfway to his study, Ned encountered Tyrion Lannister hobbling along the corridor with a sheaf of parchment under one arm. A few gold cloaks followed behind at a respectful distance. Tyrion's brow glistened with sweat, though the morning was cool. He'd been running himself ragged, organizing rations, trying to keep the city watch loyal, and meeting with alchemists about their stores of wildfire. They shared a faint, weary smile. "Lord Stark," Tyrion said, inclining his head, "I trust you've slept as little as I." "Likely less," Ned replied, though without rancor. He paused. "Any news from the harbor?" Tyrion's mismatched eyes sparkled with grim humor. "More of Stannis' ships are arriving. He seems determined to tighten the noose from the bay, but he hasn't risked another direct assault since the fiasco with the wildfire. As for Renly, it seems his main host is still encamped some leagues south, waiting for an opportune moment. The city is effectively surrounded, if you consider the fact that Tywin's men hold the roads to the west." "Trapped," Ned murmured. "Besieged, to put it politely." Tyrion gave a dry chuckle. "Though the gates remain open for now, no large force dares go in or out. With supplies dwindling, that's not sustainable." Ned's jaw tightened. "We could have evacuated more of the small folk weeks ago, but Joffrey refused. Cersei claims that emptying the city would be a show of weakness." Tyrion shrugged. "Her sense of pride may be the death of us all, and my sweet nephew's sense of cruelty does not help matters. He wants to punish someone for his frustrations. Stannis, Renly, or whomever stands in his way. That includes the populace, if we're not careful." Ned rubbed a hand across his eyes. "And yet we stand here talking. What else can we do?" Tyrion offered him a parchment. "I spoke with the new Grand Maester Arwen. He's compiled an inventory of the city's grain and fish. We have enough for a few more weeks, assuming strict rations. After that, We'll face starvation unless we break the siege or bring in supplies from the countryside." Ned scanned the parchment. His heart sank further at the meager numbers. So many souls packed behind the city walls, so little food. "Then we must consider negotiating with one of the Baratheon brothers to avert a bloodbath." Tyrion's face clouded. "I've tried. Stannis is unyielding. He claims the Iron Throne by right and demands full submission. Renly's more open to parley, but he also demands Joffrey's abdication. Cersei refuses. Tywin Lannister circles outside the city, ready to reinforce us or perhaps to fight his own war on a separate front. He insists we hold King's Landing for Joffrey's claim. No one will bend. We have the perfect recipe for a prolonged slaughter." Ned felt the weight of House Stark and the North pressing on his shoulders. He had expected to be in his grave before witnessing such devastation. "It will not improve if we do nothing. We must keep trying." Before Tyrion could respond, a gold cloak stepped forward, bowing. "My lords, the Queen Regent requests your presence in the throne room. There's an urgent matter." Tyrion's lips thinned. Never a dull moment. He turned to Ned. "Shall we?" They walked in silence through the corridor and down the winding stairs, the gold cloaks trailing behind. The Red Keep corridors glowed with a lurid light as the sun shifted behind scattered clouds, leaving odd shadows dancing across the walls. Ned could practically taste the tension in the stale air. Entering the throne room, they found Cersei standing at the base of the Iron Throne steps, her emerald eyes hard. Beside her stood Joffrey in his gilded doublet, lips twisted with impatience. Also present were members of the small council, Lord Peter Baelish with his mocking half-smile, Varys in his voluminous silks, and a small cluster of Tywin's bannermen who had come into the city recently for consultations. The gold cloaks in attendance tapped spear butts in a steady rhythm against the floor, as if to keep time with the city's anxious pulse. "Ah, at last," Cersei said, voice echoing in the chamber. "We have a problem, Lord Stark, and my brother will want to hear it too." Tyrion took a place opposite Baelish, crossing his arms. "What new calamity?" Cersei gestured to one of the Lannister bannermen, a lean man with a narrow face. "Ser Osmond here returned from a scouting mission beyond the Rosby roads. He reports that a large force of Northmen has crossed the Neck and is marching south under your son's banner, Lord Stark." Ned stiffened. "Robb," the name lodged in his chest. "He was meant to remain in the north, to hold it secure. It appears he's reconsidered," Cersei said with a thin smile. "Word is that the young wolf marches with a sizable host. Umber, Karstark, Manderly, and other bannermen. They plan to converge with Tully forces in the Riverlands, or so the rumors say." She paused, watching Ned's face. "You would know more than us if your son's movement is official. Do you deny it?" Ned exhaled slowly, fighting the swirl of conflicting emotions. Of course Robb would feel compelled to act if King's Landing was under siege, and if rumors flew that Ned was essentially a captive advisor. "I have not heard directly from my son in some time. The last raven I received said nothing of marching south. But that letter was weeks old." Tyrion frowned. "This changes the board. If the Northmen link up with the Riverlords, they'll be a formidable army." Cersei's eyes blazed. "Which underscores the need to crush Renly and Stannis swiftly, or parley in a manner that preserves Joffrey's crown. If the young wolf arrives in the Riverlands, we could face enemies on all sides." Joffrey, who had stood silent until now, slammed a small fist against the throne's arm. "I say we ride out and crush them ourselves. How dare they threaten the crown?" Ned fixed him with a cold look. "They do not threaten the crown lightly. They come to protect their liege lord me, or so they believe, from captivity and certain danger. You are free here, Lord Stark," the boy snapped, petulance in every syllable. A grim hush fell. They all knew Ned's freedom was precarious. He could not leave the city or wield real authority. He was bound by honor and by the unspoken threat to Sansa and Arya, though the girls, at least, had been allowed to depart for Winterfell. That had eased Ned's mind, but only slightly, as the city sank deeper into war. Cersei drew a breath. "Young or not, Your son's army complicates matters. The Lannister host is positioned primarily to the west and south. We can't risk dividing our forces further to repel the north as well. Unless... She trailed off, looking at Tyrion and then back at Ned. Unless House Stark can be convinced not to fight at all. Tyrion finished quietly. Is that your suggestion? Baelish's lip quirked. We might call that the best outcome for all. The Starks remain in the north. The Lannisters keep the crown. The Tyrells might be placated with, well, something lands a favorable marriage for Marjorie. Stannis can be isolated. Let him brood on Dragonstone if he refuses to yield. Ned stared at Baelish with disdain. And how do you propose we convince my son to disband an army that has likely spent weeks assembling? By letter? By threat? He would never forsake my safety on the mere word of men he barely trusts. Littlefinger smiled thinly. No, not by threats. By you, Lord Stark. Personal message. A father's command. Surely that would stay the young wolf's hand. Ned's stomach turned. To think of ordering Robb to withdraw. Every drop of paternal pride rebelled at the thought, but so did the knowledge that if Robb marched into the Riverlands, war would intensify on yet another front. The realm already burned. Perhaps he could indeed try to stop his son. But would it do any good? Robb would read the letter and suspect it was written under duress, or simply disregard the command if he feared for Ned's life. That is for me to decide, Ned said stiffly. I will pen a letter to my son, requesting more information, but I will not demand his immediate submission until I know his mind. Cersei exchanged a glance with Joffrey, then nodded. Then do so, soon. Perhaps we can avoid a northern incursion that tears the realm apart further. A hush settled over the throne room. Varys, silent thus far, lightly cleared his throat. Before we conclude, there is another matter. I have heard troubling whispers that a group of ironborn longships have been sighted around the stony shore. While it may not directly affect King's Landing yet, House Greyjoy's restlessness could spark a second conflict. If the Iron Islands decide this is the moment to reave the coasts, the North will be the first to suffer, and that might push them into further aggression. Tyrion's mouth twisted. Splendid. Another spark to the tinder. Ned's heart pounded. He recalled Theon Greyjoy's presence in Winterfell these past years as a ward and hostage to ensure Greyjoy good behavior. But that might not stop Balon Greyjoy from launching a new rebellion if he sensed weakness in the realm. All these brewing threats were entangling like vines. He gave a terse nod. I will try to address that in my letter to Robb. If the Ironborn are moving, he needs to know. Cersei dismissed them with a wave of her hand, and the gathered lords began to disperse. Ned and Tyrion lingered a moment, exchanging a look. Baelish winked at Tyrion as he passed, as though enjoying the spectacle of a realm in chaos. Varys offered a small bow, sorrowful eyes flicking from Ned to Tyrion, then followed the others out. The gold cloaks parted to let Ned and the imp exit. Outside the throne room, they paused in a corridor lined with columns. I suppose you have a letter to write, Tyrion said, his voice low. Ned nodded. I must try, though I suspect my son's mind may be set. If your letter can forestall another front in this war, it might be worth every word, Tyrion murmured. But you know it might do no good. Or worse, if young Robb believes you're under threat, he could hasten south. Ned's gaze drifted to the open window. The bright day outside felt at odds with the darkness creeping over the realm. I have to try. War is at our doorstep. I do not wish my son, hardly more than a boy, to see these horrors. Nor I, Tyrion said quietly. I have no children, but I see what such conflict does to the young. Look at Joffrey's transformation, or the chaos among the small folks' children in the streets. The city has enough orphans already. They parted ways. Ned returned to the Tower of the Hand, closed himself in his solar, and began to write. His quill scratched across parchment as he carefully chose his words. He addressed Robb as both his son and the acting Lord of Winterfell. He wrote that the situation in King's Landing was complicated, and though he, Ned, was forced to remain, he was not entirely helpless. He urged Robb not to begin open hostilities against the crown unless absolutely necessary. He warned of Balon Greyjoy's potential designs. Finally, he ended with paternal advice and a plea. We must keep the North safe. Do not let your sense of duty or your fear for me force you into a path that might doom us all. Yet even as he set the letter aside for sealing, Ned felt that it lacked the force to dissuade a determined son. One short letter could not convey the swirl of politics, the hidden threats in the court, or the near famines of the city. He recalled Catelyn's last words before she'd left King's Landing, to trust in Robb's judgment, that their children were stronger than they seemed. With a heavy heart, Ned sealed the letter and summoned a Ravenkeeper. At the threshold, he paused, pen hovering, then added a postscript with a single line. I love you, my son. Be wise and be strong. Then he let the wax harden beneath his signet. Hours later, that raven departed the Red Keep, wings cutting through the heavy summer air. It flew north, bearing Ned's words to a young lord forging his own destiny among the swaying fields of the Riverlands. A small hope flickered in Ned's chest that maybe, just maybe, Robb would heed him. That night, the city seemed to hold its breath. The usual noise of nighttime revelers in King's Landing was subdued. Taverns closed early, fearful of riot or looting. The gold cloaks patrolled in pairs, eyes darting at every shadow. In the Tower of the Hand, Ned tried to sleep, but night terrors haunted him. The memory of wildfire on the river, the vision of the realm's lords turning on each other, and the faint echo of Bran's near-murder that had sparked an older suspicion. Or had it? The attempt on Bran's life seemed so small compared to all this. But that event still bothered Ned deeply. He wondered if, in another life, that vile deed might have lit the fuse of war between House Stark and House Lannister. In this life, the fuse had been lit anyway, by a bigger secret. He prayed for the morning to bring some relief, but morning brought only more problems. At dawn, a flustered messenger woke Ned with the news that a brawl had erupted in one of the flea-bottom squares overnight. A handful of hungry smallfolk had tried to raid a grain store. The gold cloaks intervened. A riot nearly broke out. 4 men died, and many more were injured. The store was partially burned. With every day of shortage, the populace grew more restless. Ned grimly ordered an inquiry, suspecting it would yield little but more anger. He dressed and made his way to the Red Keep's Great Hall for the midday council. Tyrion arrived looking equally exhausted, his face drawn. Cersei was not present, sending a note that she was tending to personal matters with Joffrey. Baelish and Varys were in attendance, as well as a sprinkling of minor lords who hoped to glean profit or advantage from the city's chaos. Lord Peter Baelish led the discussion with a cheery voice that contradicted the gloom. The city's finances are in as dire straits as the city's morale. The crown's debts mount daily, especially as we must pay premium rates for smuggled grain. The Tyrell blockade to the south cuts off most supply lines. We're forced to rely on what can be ferried in from Lannister-aligned regions, at a high markup. Varys sighed. And there is fresh news that Stannis has begun constructing siege engines on the far side of the Blackwater. He may attempt a land approach around the Rosby Road, using the cover of the hills. Our scouts believe he's working with local lords there, or subduing them forcibly. Stannis will not yield. Ned's voice was heavy. He believes he is the rightful king. Baelish spread his hands. Well, he's likely right by the strict line of succession, but that hardly matters once swords are drawn. The question is, how do we keep him at bay long enough to break his resolve, or else come to terms? Ned glanced at Tyrion. Any success in negotiations? Tyrion shook his head. Stannis demands unconditional surrender. He knows Joffrey's parentage secrets are out. If we cede the throne, he might spare the city from plunder. But Cersei and Tywin refuse to countenance such a step, and Joffrey's a lost cause. He'd rather die a king than live unseated. A quiet fell over the table. Ned swallowed the bitter truth. If Joffrey insisted on fighting to the end, the city would become a battlefield. Countless innocents would die for the pride of the Lannisters and the claims of the Baratheon brothers. Honor warred with practicality in Ned's mind. Duty demanded he preserve peace. Yet how could he allow a false king to butcher thousands for a lost cause? Their council ended in frustration. With no new strategy, only a recitation of the city's woes and the ring of enemies closing in. Ned left feeling heavier than ever. Outside the great hall, he found Tyrion near a window, massaging his forehead. The dwarf looked up as Ned approached. "It's a dance of despair, Lord Stark," Tyrion said dryly. "We scheme, we plead, we plan, and the war only grows closer." Ned rubbed his temples. There must be something. Another attempt at a great council? Or a compromise that sees Joffrey step down but keeps the Lannisters secure? A wedge between Stannis and Renly, perhaps? Tyrion frowned. "We tried that wedge approach. Renly is amenable to certain deals, but only if Joffrey is removed. And Stannis sees Renly as a usurper, so the brothers loathe each other almost as much as they loathe us. If we remove Joffrey, the Lannister name would lose face unless we installed Tommen. But the rumors about Jaime and Cersei would taint Tommen too. My father might attempt a council that enthrones Tommen, claims ignorance of incest, and exiles Cersei. But would that satisfy Stannis? Likely not. Stannis is too rigid." Ned stared into the courtyard below, where gold cloaks drilled information. "The realm is cracking like ice on a frozen river. We keep hoping to find a solid path, but the water beneath churns. Too many claimants, too many grudges. And in the north, a new storm brews with my son's army. Soon the Tullus will join him. I fear the riverlands will burn." Tyrion's shoulders sank. If only we could gather all the powers of the realm and force them to talk once more. But that attempt at a great council collapsed. The lords are too proud. War is their language now. As they stood there, a swirl of commotion rose from the courtyard. Lannister guards rushed toward the gatehouse, shouting. Moments later, the clang of chains rattled, and a battered figure on horseback rode through the gates. An arrow lodged in his side. A hush fell among onlookers as the man, dressed in patched leathers bearing no clear sigil, collapsed from his saddle. One of the gold cloaks caught him just before he hit the ground. Ned and Tyrion hurried down, hearts pounding with renewed alarm. Up close, Ned saw the man was young, perhaps not yet 30, with sunburned cheeks and wild eyes. His breath came in ragged gasps. I bring word," he choked, wincing as a guard tried to steady him. "From the Rosby Road. The king's men. There we were attacked." A maester was summoned, pressing a cloth to stanch the bleeding around the arrow. Ned knelt, gently gripping the messenger's shoulder. "Steady, friend. Breathe. Which king's men? Joffrey's or Stannis's?" Stannis has advanced," the man croaked, spitting blood. "They moved at night, built a causeway, attacked the outlying camps. Our men scattered. Rosby's fallen, I think. They'll come for the city next." His eyes rolled back, and he gasped one last time before going limp. The maester shook his head in quiet resignation. Tyrion stared at Ned. "Rosby is too close for comfort. If they push further, they'll be at the northern gate in days. We're not ready for a siege on two fronts." Ned felt his stomach knot. "Let's get to the battlements. We must see for ourselves." They climbed the walls, accompanied by anxious guards. From the northern rampart, the land stretched out in a haze of summer heat. In the distance, faint columns of smoke rose into the sky, too far to see clearly, but close enough to confirm that small hamlets or outposts near Rosby had been put to the torch. A hush fell among the watchers. War was no longer a rumor on the horizon. It was a blazing fact creeping ever closer. Cersei arrived soon after, escorted by a phalanx of Lannister guards. She stared at the distant smoke, her face pale with fury. How dare Stannis advance without fear? He must know the city is not easily taken. Tyrion gave a weary shrug. Perhaps he's gambling that our morale is broken, or that Renly will soon attack from the south, forcing us to split our forces. He's not wrong that we're stretched thin. Cersei's lips curled. Then we must strike first. We can't wait for them to form a full siege. We'll ride out and crush them along the Rosby Road. Put them to flight. Ned turned sharply, a burst of anger in his eyes. "You speak of riding out and crushing them as though it's a trivial matter. Our men are exhausted, short on supplies, and we're outnumbered. The Gold Cloaks are loyal to the city, not necessarily to Joffrey. They won't throw their lives away in a hopeless charge. Are you blind to the cost?" She glared back. "I do what is necessary to protect the crown. If you prefer cowering behind walls, that is your choice. The Lannister men will fight." Tyrion interjected softly. "Even if we gather every gold cloak, plus the Lannister guards, we won't equal Stannis' disciplined force. Unless Father arrives soon from the west with the main host, any sally out of the city would be a gamble." Cersei's eyes flickered with frustration. "Then Father must be summoned more urgently. I will send a rider immediately, demanding he march on King's Landing with his full strength. Joffrey will not wait while Stannis picks off our outlying positions." Ned watched her hurry down the steps, flanked by her guards. He exhaled, tension knotting his back. "If Tywin comes with his main host, we'll have a battle outside the walls that will shake the city to its foundation. And if Renly times his move, we'll be caught between two armies. The city will be strangled from 3 directions." "That is the shape of war," Tyrion said grimly. "It seems inevitable. We might hold them off for a time with our remaining wildfire caches. But the question is how many lives we are willing to sacrifice." Ned gazed again toward the smoke on the horizon. How had the realm come to this so swiftly? Though the seeds of conflict had long been planted, it felt like mere weeks ago that he was investigating rumors about a dagger and the Lannisters' involvement in Bran's injury. Now that old suspicion felt distant, swallowed by the monstrous reality of a multi-king civil war. In the days that followed, the city braced for attack from the north. Scouts returned with conflicting reports. Some said Stannis had entrenched near Rosby, building field fortifications. Others claimed a portion of his force marched east, perhaps to loop around the city. Tensions soared. The Gold Cloaks had to quell more riots over dwindling food stores. Joffrey lurked in the Red Keep, delivering threats about traitors in the city who would face his wrath. Rumors flew that Tywin was indeed on the move, but no one knew how soon he might arrive. Then, in the midst of this anxious vigil, a raven arrived from the north. Not the letter from Robb that Ned had hoped for, but a dire message from Maester Luwin. It spoke of unrest in the north, Ironborn raids on the Stony Shore, threats to Torrhen Square, rumors that Balon Greyjoy prepared to declare himself king of the Isles and the North. Catelyn had departed Winterfell to try to broker peace with the Lords of the Neck, or so the letter said, but the situation was dire. The letter closed with a plea that Ned restore order or return if he could. It offered no mention of Robb's location or the size of his host, only that he had indeed marched south, leaving the north vulnerable. Ned read the letter twice, heart pounding with dread. The Ironborn threatened to tear at the north's coastline while the realm's main focus was on the Iron Throne. If Balon Greyjoy crowned himself, the north would be forced to defend on 2 fronts, one in the south, one in the west. Robb's departure might open Winterfell itself to attack if the Ironborn launched a bold strike. Tyrion found Ned in the Solar, the letter clenched in his hand. "More ill news, I see," the imp said softly. Ned held out the parchment. Tyrion read it, his expression darkening. "The Greyjoys choose their moment well. Chaos is a ladder, as Peter Baelish likes to say. Balon thinks to slip free of the Iron Throne's nominal authority. And with your son away, the North is exposed." Ned's gaze fixed on a corner of the desk, as if trying to see through it. "My wife is traveling the Neck, presumably to treat with the Crannogmen or see if there's any chance to hold Moat Cailin. This war, it threatens to tear everything apart." He paused, closing his eyes. "And I can do nothing, penned here in King's Landing, forced to watch the Lannisters and Baratheons slash at each other." Tyrion placed a small hand on Ned's arm. "I regret it has come to this. I know it's small comfort, but we are not entirely helpless. If we can broker any kind of truce." A shout from outside interrupted them. A gold cloak burst in, panting. "They're here, Stannis' outriders. We can see their banners near the Rosby approach, moving this way." The city watch is assembling on the walls. Ned and Tyrion hurried out, hearts thudding. From the ramparts, they could see a line of banners in the distance, dark shapes against the rolling fields. Here and there, a standard flapped. A flaming heart of the Lord of Light, the sigil Stannis had adopted after his contact with foreign priests. Drums echoed faintly across the plain. Though it looked to be a scouting force rather than Stannis' entire army, it confirmed that an engagement was near at hand. Within the hour, Joffrey and Cersei had mustered a defensive posture. The gold cloaks took up positions along the northern walls, setting crossbows and scorpions. Atop the gatehouse, archers readied themselves. Tyrion and Ned ascended the main guard tower. As they peered through a far-eye lens, they saw the outriders in detail, cavalry in disciplined lines, a few footmen trailing behind, at least 300 strong. They made no attempt to advance further yet, just stood in silent demonstration. The message was clear. Stannis was at the gates. Tyrion lowered the far eye. Likely they want us to see them, to remind us that the next step could be a full assault. Or perhaps they're prodding our defenses. Ned felt his breath come shallow. We might be forced to sally out to meet them, or they'll pick off any supply caravans. This is the start. Then came a flurry of movement. From the outriders' ranks rode a single horseman bearing a white banner of truce. He cantered forward. The city watch tensed, crossbow strings creaking. The horseman halted within arrow range, raising his banner high. A loud hail carried across the field. A messenger from Lord Stannis Baratheon, rightful king of the Undulls and the First Men. We seek parley with the leaders of this city. Murmuring rippled across the walls. Ned glanced at Tyrion. A parley. Perhaps they want an immediate surrender. Or an ultimatum, Tyrion said. Best to hear them out. Perhaps we can glean some advantage. A herald from the gold cloaks shouted back, "Hold your ground. The hand of the king and the royal council shall send word." The messenger remained still, his horse stamping the grass. The small council quickly gathered in a makeshift strategy room behind the northern gatehouse. Cersei joined them, wearing a cloak of crimson, her face taut with anger. Joffrey was there too, ignoring Tyrion's attempt at a calming word. Ser Jacelyn Bywater, commander of the city watch, hovered close by, uncertain. Baelish, Varys, and a few other lesser lords formed the circle, tension practically suffocating the cramped space. Cersei's voice was cold as she addressed them. Stannis wants parley. We know what that means. He demands we open the gates and lay down our arms, or he'll bring his full force to destroy us. I say we refuse. Let him waste time and men on a fruitless negotiation. We are the rightful defenders of King's Landing. Ned stepped forward, eyes dark with resolve. That is madness. If we refuse even to speak, he may abandon any notion of mercy and commence an attack. A parley might buy time for Tywin's reinforcements to arrive or for Renly to make a move. Let me speak with his envoy. We lose nothing by hearing them out. The Queen Regent frowned at him. You'd speak on behalf of the crown? Do you forget your place, Stark? Tyrion arched an eyebrow. I am the king's hand in name, though I've not been able to fulfill that role properly. Let me go or let Lord Stark go. Either way, someone with authority must meet Stannis' messenger. Better that we do it in the safety of the city gates, not out in the open. Joffrey sneered, impatience coloring his pale features. I'll not let that old fool speak for me. If anyone goes, it should be my uncle or myself. Cersei put a hand on Joffrey's arm. You will not risk yourself. Let Tyrion do it. He's cunning enough not to be fooled by Stannis' plots. And I'll go with him, Ned said, voice steady. Stannis might be more inclined to respect someone he knows cannot abide false kings. He may see me as a man of honor. Cersei waved a dismissive hand. Fine, but fail us, Stark, and you will have yourself to blame when the city walls are stormed. Ned bit back a retort. He turned to Tyrion. Shall we? Within the hour, a small party emerged from the gatehouse. Tyrion rode a stout palfrey. Ned rode a taller courser, the sword at his hip more for ceremony than for show. Around them, a ring of gold cloaks formed a protective line, crossbows half lowered. Opposite, Stannis' outrider messenger sat astride his own horse, a cloth-wrapped scroll in hand. He was a stern-looking man with iron-gray hair and a gaunt face. As Ned and Tyrion approached, the messenger inclined his head but did not smile. "I am Ser Justin Massey," he said loudly, "charged by King Stannis Baratheon to deliver terms." Tyrion inclined his head in return. "I am Tyrion Lannister, representing King Joffrey Baratheon's council. This is Lord Eddard Stark, the king's hand." Ser Justin's mouth tightened at the mention of Joffrey. He swept a keen gaze over Ned, perhaps recalling Ned's reputation as an honorable lord. Then he unrolled the scroll, reading in a crisp, clear voice. "Stannis of the House Baratheon, first of his name, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms by right of blood and law, offers the city a chance to avert bloodshed. Surrender the false king, Joffrey Waters, along with his mother and all conspirators who have supported their treason. Open the gates to Stannis' forces. Proclaim Stannis the true king, and the city's inhabitants shall be spared. Those who resist will be treated as traitors to the realm." A hush followed. Tyrion glanced at Ned, and Ned's jaw tightened. "Your so-called king would have us deliver a child to him for punishment?" Ned asked. Ser Justin's eyes flashed. "He is not a child but a pretender, bastard born of incest. The realm knows the truth. Stannis is not without mercy, but traitors must answer for their crimes." Ned exhaled, forcing calm. "These terms are harsh. Cersei Lannister will never yield her son. A full surrender would be unthinkable." "Harsh times demand harsh measures," Ser Justin said, reciting from memory. "Stannis extends mercy to the small folk, the gold cloaks, and those lords who lay down arms now. He likewise promises safe conduct for you, Lord Stark, in recognition of your service to King Robert and your known devotion to the law. But that courtesy does not extend to the Lannisters. They must face judgment." Tyrion offered a crooked smile. "That's quite the list of demands. I see no mention of compromise, nor any smaller concessions. So your parley is not a negotiation but an ultimatum." Ser Justin bowed his head in acknowledgement. "Yes, if you refuse, King Stannis will begin siege operations in earnest. Rosby has already fallen, and he has enough men to encircle the city's northern and eastern sides. If the city will not yield, the cost in lives will be on your heads." Ned's eyes shifted to Tyrion, who gave him a slight nod. They'd expected nothing less. "We hear your demands," Ned said, raising his voice so the gold cloaks on the walls might hear. "We must confer with the council. If your king is wise, he will allow a brief respite for us to consider. More bloodshed helps no one." Ser Justin studied them. "One day," he said after a moment's pause. "At dawn tomorrow we expect your answer. If you have not signaled your surrender or acceptance of these terms by then, you can expect Stannis' banners to march." The man spurred his horse and galloped back to his formation. Tyrion and Ned sat motionless for a few moments, the weight of the threat sinking in. Then they turned and rode slowly back through the gates. The great portcullis slammed shut behind them, iron chains rattling in the hush of the courtyard. Inside the gatehouse, Ned dismounted, heart pounding. 24 hours to decide if we hand over the Queen Regent and Joffrey, or face siege. Tyrion slid off his saddle with a grunt. "We both know Cersei will never surrender. Tywin would not allow it either. They will fight, and so a siege it will be." Ned thought of the starving small folk, the overcrowded streets. "Then tomorrow or the next day or the next will face blood and fire, unless the gods themselves intervene." They reported Stannis' terms to the waiting council in a tense meeting. Cersei predictably spat at the idea of handing over Joffrey. Joffrey himself flew into a rage and threatened to hang Stannis in the Red Keep once he was captured. The Gold Cloak's commander looked grim, but nodded that they would defend the walls. Tyrion and Ned both argued for at least offering a token negotiation, perhaps stalling for time. But Joffrey dismissed it with a sneer. In the end, they resolved to brace for an assault. That night, The city was a cauldron of fear. People boarded up their homes or tried to flee, but the gates were closed, and only a trickle of folk slipped out, those with enough coin to bribe the guards. Tension crackled in the hot summer air. On the walls, archers nocked arrows, scanning the plains for any sign of movement. In the Red Keep, Ned Stark found himself alone in the Godswood, a meager place of southern weirwoods with no true face. He knelt before the heart tree, though it was not a true northern heart tree, and closed his eyes. In the silence, he murmured prayers for his family, for the city, and for a miracle that might stop the coming slaughter. He reflected again on the fragile path that had led them all here, but no voice answered in the rustling leaves. At dawn, horns echoed in the distance, Stannis' war horns, signaling the next stage of the siege. From the northern ramparts, Ned watched as lines of infantry and siege towers began to form. They were not yet advancing, but they were making ready. The day passed in a haze of frantic preparations, barricading weak points, organizing watch rotations, distributing limited stocks of arrows, hauling up barrels of wildfire under Tyrion's direction. In the streets below, the small folk cowered in doorways, waiting for the storm. Late that afternoon, word reached them that Tywin Lannister was still a week's march away, perhaps more, and Renly's host waited in the south, rumored to be near Tumbleton. With each new piece of news, Ned felt hope slip further from his grasp. Cersei, rarely one to show fear, had grown paler by the hour, and Joffrey rampaged in the courtyards, practicing with his crossbow and yelling at servants. None of it would matter once Stannis' siege lines closed in. Ned made one final attempt at reason. He approached Joffrey in the courtyard, braving the boy's foul temper. "Your Grace," he said calmly, "I urge you once more to consider terms. A partial surrender, a negotiated settlement. Anything to spare the city from ruin. Stannis will be merciless if he sees no sign of contrition." Joffrey turned on him, eyes blazing with scorn. "Spare me your lectures, traitor. You think I've forgotten how you questioned my birth? My father was King Robert, and I am his rightful heir. Stannis is the one who should kneel, not me." Ned fought down the urge to rail at the boy. Instead, he bowed his head. "I speak only for the lives of the people you would rule. A king should protect." "Silence!" Joffrey barked, raising his crossbow. For one horrifying moment, Ned thought the boy might shoot him. Then Joffrey lowered the weapon with a sneer. "I'll hear no more from you. Go hide in your tower if you lack the courage to fight." He waved dismissively, turning to a Kingsguard knight for more target practice. Ned stood there a moment, fury and pity mingling in his chest, before he walked away. That night, the first of Stannis' catapults hurled stones against the northern walls. Great chunks of rock slammed into the battlements, splintering stone and sending showers of rubble into the courtyards. Screams erupted among the defenders. The City Watch tried to return fire with scorpions, but their aim was uncertain in the dark. Through the gloom, the flaming pitch soared overhead like fiery comets, striking rooftops or crashing into the ramparts. Smoke billowed. By dawn, the northern section of King's Landing's outer wall was pockmarked with damage, and the catapults had only grown more numerous. So began the siege of King's Landing, an inevitable reckoning brought about by pride, secrets, and ambition. Stannis battered the walls from the north and east, while the city's defenders scrambled to plug holes and contain fires. Food grew scarcer by the day. Bodies piled up in infirmaries. Joffrey exhorted the gold cloaks to hold, offering insults or empty promises. Cersei paced the Red Keep's halls, casting suspicious glares at anyone who might falter. Tyrion directed the use of wildfire, carefully rationing it to avoid accidentally burning the city down. Through it all, Ned Stark stood a lonely vigil, assisting where he could, rallying men on the walls, praying in the quiet corners. He had never desired war, but war had found him, and the realm reeled under its weight. Beyond those walls, Renly waited with a vast southern host. Tywin marched in from the west. Robb Stark moved somewhere in the Riverlands, possibly clashing with Lannister bannermen. Balon Greyjoy stirred on the western coasts of the north, and rumors of Daenerys Targaryen across the sea flickered in hushed corners, though no one in the capital paid them much heed. The War of 5 Kings or more was upon Westeros, unstoppable as a tide. In the weeks that followed, Stannis' siege tightened. Assaults came in waves. The defenders hurled rocks, spears, and wildfire bombs from the battlements. Stannis lost hundreds to the blazing green flames near the outer ditch, but still his men advanced, driven by his iron will. Several times Ned risked his life on the walls to coordinate defense, rescuing wounded men or shouting orders to hold ranks. He fought with a sword in hand, though the unending horror of pitched battles sickened him. Tyrion too put himself in danger, leading small nighttime sorties to burn siege engines, surprising all who had once dismissed him as a bookish dwarf. Stories spread among the men, how the imp had personally ignited wildfire trenches to halt a forward push, returning singed but triumphant. And yet, for every small victory, the city bled. The catapults did not relent. Food stores withered. Disease crept through the cramped alleyways, claiming the weak. Whispers circulated about how long they could hold out. Morale sagged. One sweltering afternoon, Ned found Tyrion leaning against a shattered merlin, sweat trickling down his brow. Below them, the battered plain outside the walls was littered with broken siege towers and corpses. The churned mud gave off a foul stench in the heat, a mixture of rot and ash. Carrion crows wheeled overhead. Tyrion gave Ned a wan smile. "We repelled the last assault, but they'll try again soon enough. Our archers are nearly out of arrows." Ned surveyed the ruin. "We can't survive many more days like this. If Tywin does not arrive soon, the city could fall." Tyrion nodded heavily. "I received a raven from Father this morning. He's still at least 4 days out, pinned by a force of Edmure Tully's men near Riverrun. It seems your son Robb made it across the Twins, forging an alliance with Walder Frey. That allowed the River Lords to coordinate with him, forcing Father into a stalemate." A sliver of pride touched Ned, though overshadowed by dread. "Robb is cunning, then, but that cunning keeps Tywin from relieving this city." "Yes," Tyrion murmured. "Your son is ironically helping Stannis by holding Father at bay." Ned let out a long, shaking breath. "War upon war, and the small folk pay the price. This is the realm's fate." They heard a sudden cry. Looking down from the rampart, they saw a small group of defenders pulling something from the moat, a body or what remained of it. The men's voices carried faintly upward in a wail of despair. Another friend lost, another casualty. Tyrion's expression tightened, and Ned thought he saw tears in the dwarf's eyes for just a moment before Tyrion turned away. "I'm going to the Alchemist's Guild," Tyrion said softly. "We have a new batch of wildfire to distribute. Pray it does not explode beneath us instead." Then he shuffled off, leaving Ned alone with the stench of death. Night fell, blanketing the city in darkness broken only by torchlight. The same cycle of fear repeated. The watchers on the walls braced for an assault. The small folk huddled in cellars. Cersei and Joffrey fumed within the Red Keep. Ned paced the corridors, sleepless. Just past midnight, a messenger came running with news. Movement on the south side of the city. Had Renly arrived? A spark of hope flared, but the messenger explained that no, it was not a siege from the south. Instead, they saw torches in the far distance, some unknown force perhaps approaching. Cersei mobilized scouts, but in the darkness, confusion reigned. By dawn, word came that it was a small Lannister contingent from the west, battered and exhausted, bearing fresh tidings. Ser Kevan Lannister, Tywin's brother, led them. They slipped past the uncertain lines near the Rose Road, guided by local knowledge. Ser Kevan arrived at the Red Keep near midday, demanding an audience with Joffrey and the council. Ned and Tyrion joined them in the throne room as Kevan Lannister bowed, sweat-soaked and travel-stained. "My lords," Kevan began, voice echoing in the tense hall. "I bring urgent news. Lord Tywin remains engaged with the forces of Riverrun, as you know. But more dire is the fact that another large host has been sighted crossing the Trident. House Stark's banners mingled with Tully banners, heading southeast. It said your son, Ned, leads them in person. He paused, then corrected himself. Lord Stark, I suppose young Robb has the main command. Forgive me. Ned's heart squeezed. So Robb truly was in the thick of it. The war raged across the Riverlands. Kevin turned to Joffrey, continuing. They've hammered our supply lines, forcing us to abandon Harrenhal. Jaime was recalled to regroup with Lord Tywin. If we cannot break free of that engagement soon, we cannot come to King's Landing in time. You must hold, or else withdraw. Cersei's face darkened. Withdraw? Where? King's Landing is the seat of the throne. Joffrey fumed from the Iron Throne. We do not run. We fight. Kevin lowered his gaze. I fear fighting on 2 or 3 fronts is near impossible. My lord brother has considered a strategic withdrawal to the Westerlands, should the city prove indefensible. But he hoped to rally enough men to break Stannis. Now, with Robb Stark's forces sowing chaos, the timeline is uncertain. Joffrey sneered, but fear flickered in his eyes. Cowards, all of you. I'll feed you to my dogs if you keep talking about retreat. Ned and Tyrion exchanged a glance. Tyrion cleared his throat. So father is effectively pinned. We cannot rely on him. That leaves us to face Stannis alone. Ser Kevin hesitated, then nodded. Yes, unless you find a miracle. In the silence that followed, Baelish coughed softly. Well, there is Renly. Perhaps we can contrive to let Renly and Stannis turn on each other. If we entice Renly to move first. Promise him something, the Tyrells crave glory. If Renly were to converge here, Stannis might withdraw or be forced to fight his brother. The city might be spared a direct onslaught. Cersei's lip curled. Renly is a traitor too. Many are traitors, my queen, Baelish replied smoothly. But sometimes we can pit traitor against traitor. We only need Renly to attack Stannis, or at least engage him. If he does, the siege breaks. Tyrion drummed his fingers on the table. An intriguing notion. But what do we offer Renly that convinces him to help us? We can't just hand him the throne. Baelish spread his hands in a shrug. What if we offered him a regency over the boy king, or an alliance by marriage to secure a future line? Or we propose dividing the realm, giving him the south while Joffrey keeps the capital in name. There are ways to spin illusions that might tempt Renly. Ned tensed. That is madness. Splitting the realm invites chaos. Chaos is already here, Baelish said sweetly. We must choose among lesser evils. Joffrey slouched on the throne, eyes flicking between them. I care not how you do it. Just kill Stannis. You have my leave to say anything to Renly if it means I keep my crown. And so a new plan emerged, a desperate attempt to coax Renly into attacking Stannis. The council hammered out details. They'd send an envoy offering vague promises that Joffrey would name Renly chief advisor and protector of the South, or some other grand title. They'd hint that once Stannis was beaten, the Lannisters might be open to further negotiations. The entire scheme reeked of lies and short-term illusions, but they were cornered. Either they tried to lure Renly into the fray, or they waited for Stannis to starve the city out. Ned despised it. He cornered Tyrion afterward, away from prying ears. We manipulate Renly, feed him false hope, all to unleash him on Stannis? Have we no honor left? Tyrion sighed. Less and less by the day, Lord Stark. But the alternative is letting Stannis break through these walls. You know what he'll do if he captures Joffrey and Cersei. And if that happens, the city might pay a bloody price. Perhaps we can stall long enough for your son to force father free, so Tywin can come here. Or maybe we find a genuine negotiation. The point is to buy time. Ned's mouth felt dry. He remembered the letter he'd sent Robb, urging restraint. If only his son could somehow bring an end to the Lannister hold on the throne from afar. But that too meant more bloodshed in the Riverlands. It's all a labyrinth of false promises. Tyrion met his gaze sadly. Such is war. If there were an easier path, I'd have chosen it long ago. And so the envoy set forth, a minor lord sworn to the Lannisters, under a white banner, carrying sealed letters to Renly Baratheon's camp. While they waited for a reply, the siege continued. Stannis's men attempted more bombardments, battered the outer walls, and dug trenches around the city. The defenders repelled them time and again with wildfire, archers, and desperate courage. Each clash left more bodies in the fields. Black smoke choked the sky on many evenings, blotting out the sunset as though the realm itself wept. All the while, Ned thought of Winterfell, of the children left behind. He thought of Robb forging alliances with the River Lords. He worried about the Greyjoy threat along the North's coastline, which the Maester said was growing. And in the darkest hours of the night, he recalled that single pivotal moment in Catelyn's letter, describing how she had let Tyrion go at the Crossroads Inn. Perhaps that act had spared them an earlier conflict with the Lannisters, but here they were, enmeshed in a far greater war. Could it have been worse had Tyrion been captured? Maybe open war would have started sooner, with the North facing the West in a personal vendetta. Or maybe the realm would still have ended in bloodshed over the question of succession. Ned concluded that no single choice could have altered the avalanche of events that Robert's death unleashed. At last, after more weeks of siege, a messenger returned from Renly. No white banner, but a plain surcoat spattered with mud. He barely made it inside the city walls before Stannis's pickets harried him. Exhausted and frightened, he delivered a sealed letter to the Red Keep. The next morning, the council gathered to hear its contents. Cersei, Tyrion, Joffrey, Ned, and the others assembled around the table in the Tower of the Hand. Tyrion broke the seal, scanning the letter. His eyebrows rose. Renly will consider cooperating, if we promise him the wardenship of the South, plus the immediate betrothal of Margaery Tyrell to Joffrey. He also wants half the royal treasury as compensation for the war effort, seats on the small council for his key allies, and the enforcement of certain trade concessions favoring the Reach. Essentially, he wants to rule from Highgarden in all but name. Cersei scoffed, but Joffrey's eyes glittered at the mention of Margaery Tyrell. The boy's arrogance soared at the notion of a new bride, especially one rumored to be quite beautiful. "That's acceptable," he said rashly, ignoring the council's stunned looks. "Acceptable?" Cersei snapped. "Giving away half the treasury, half the power." But Joffrey cut her off. "I am the king, and I say it is worth it if Renly will help destroy Stannis." Tyrion raised a brow. "Even if we accept these demands, can Renly arrive in time to do anything but watch the city burn?" Baelish chimed in. "He's closer than Tywin. If he marches now, he might engage Stannis within a fortnight. If Stannis is forced to split his forces or defend an attack from the rear, we might be able to sally forth and break the siege. Or we wait for them to fight each other outside the walls and then sweep in." Cersei glared around the table. "And after that, Renly will hold half the realm's power. We can't trust him. We might trade one threat for another." Joffrey waved impatiently. "We'll deal with him after. Let him think he's won. We're not giving him anything we can't take back." Ned clenched his jaw. He would have spoken against such duplicity, but he knew it was useless. Joffrey was determined to keep the throne by any means. If these new alliances collapsed, more war would follow. Still, if Renly's arrival ended the siege, it might spare thousands of innocents. Ned said nothing, biting his tongue for the sake of the city's small folk. So they penned a reply, an acceptance of Renly's terms, with flowery language proclaiming a holy alliance of the crown and the Reach. The letter promised Joffrey's betrothal to Margaery once the war was settled. It also offered immediate seats on the small council to two of Renly's key allies, Randyll Tarly and Mathis Rowan, once they arrived in King's Landing. They sealed the letter with the royal sigil and dispatched it with the same brave courier, hoping the man could slip past Stannis' lines again. Days turned into a brutal slog. The city's defenders repulsed 3 more attempts by Stannis to breach the walls. Losses were severe on both sides. The moats, trenches, and battered fields outside King's Landing were sown with the dead. Every morning, the crows feasted anew. Ned fought exhaustion and despair as he made his rounds among the wounded, their cries echoing in his ears long after he tried to sleep. At length, New rumors spread. Renly had begun marching north from Bitterbridge with a massive host. Scouts reported the banners of House Tyrell, House Florent, those who had not followed Stannis, and numerous minor lords. Stannis, aware of this threat, sent a portion of his troops to fortify the southern approach, creating a tenuous ring around the city. But the ring was not complete. He lacked the men to encircle the entire sprawling capital while simultaneously preparing to face Renly. One late afternoon, Ned stood on the southern battlements, staring into the distance. The haze of summer heat shimmered over the fields. Tyrion joined him, limping slightly from a minor wound sustained in the last skirmish. If Renly truly marches, we might see a grand battle south of the city, Tyrion said. Stannis will have to pull men from the northern assault. That might be our chance to push out and break the siege. Ned eyed him. You mean sally forth to kill Stannis's men while they fight Renly? That's a butchery. Men dying on all sides. Tyrion's voice was quiet. Yes, war is butchery. I'm too tired to pretend otherwise. Ned glanced at the sky. Sunset approached, painting it a sullen red. All this blood, and the realm fractures more each day. My son battles Tywin in the Riverlands. The Ironborn raid the north. The small folk starve here. Even if Renly breaks Stannis, the war won't end. There's still the question of who truly should sit the throne. Tyrion nodded. A question that might haunt Westeros for years to come. But for now, it's about survival. We do what we must. Their conversation was cut short by a hue and cry from the watchtower. A line of mounted riders had emerged on the southern horizon, galloping fast. The city watch readied bows, unsure if this was friend or foe. Ned and Tyrion hurried down to investigate, accompanied by a handful of guards. Soon enough, the riders reached the closed southern gates, waving a banner of House Tyrell. One rider, tall and regal, shouted for admittance in Renly's name. After cautious exchange, they were allowed inside the outer gate but kept at spear point. The rider removed his helm, revealing Loras Tyrell, the Knight of Flowers. His fine features were drawn with dust and fatigue, but his eyes gleamed with determination. I come on behalf of King Renly, he declared. We approach from the south with our full strength. In 3 days' time, we shall engage Stannis and break this siege. You have the vow of House Tyrell. Word spread through the city like wildfire. The battered defenders dared to hope. Some cheered in the streets. Others scorned the Tyrell presence, calling them opportunists. But all recognized the significance. King's Landing might soon be free of Stannis's choking grip. If Renly's host arrived in time and fought with skill, the ring around the city could be shattered. Cersei and Joffrey received Ser Loras in the Red Keep's audience chamber with a show of cordiality. Joffrey praised the Tyrells, calling them true friends of the crown. Loras bowed stiffly, not bothering to hide his contempt for Joffrey, but he promised that once the Tyrell banners arrived, they would coordinate with the city's defenders for a joint strike against Stannis. Ned observed all this from the sidelines, torn by conflicting emotions. Renly might save thousands inside the city from starvation, but this so-called rescue was just one more link in the chain of endless war. At dawn, Loras departed to rejoin Renly's vanguard, leaving behind a few knights to finalize plans. The city braced itself for a final confrontation. Stannis' scouts must have already seen the Tyrell approach, because his bombardments grew fiercer, as if he hoped to break the walls before Renly arrived. Day after day, the men on the ramparts fought off scaling ladders and siege towers. Night after night, they endured the crash of stones and the roar of fire. Casualties mounted on both sides. The Northmen under Robb and the Tullis remained locked with Tywin's host in the Riverlands, so no relief came from that quarter. All eyes turned south. Then, one fateful morning, the watchers on the southern walls spied a mass of banners on the horizon. The Golden Rose of Tyrell, the Stag of Renly, and countless lesser sigils. An army so large it seemed to stretch across the fields in a wave of steel. The entire city roused. Men climbed the battlements, peering out with battered hope. Renly's arrival forced Stannis' hand. The smaller Baratheon brother turned at last from the northern approach. He redeployed some siege weapons and regiments southward. Tension soared within the city. Tyrion ordered a readiness for a sally if Stannis weakened the northern lines. On the walls, Ned Stark readied himself once more, sword in hand, though the idea of fighting another dawn of carnage weighed heavily on his soul. As midday heat bore down, the horns of Renly's host sounded. Stannis's horns answered. Far across the dusty plain, Ned could just make out rows of infantry forming up. Banners snapped in the breeze. For a brief moment, the battlefield was eerily silent, both sides waiting to see who would strike first. Then the thunder of war began. Cavalry charges, screams, the clang of steel. Renly's cavalry hammered into Stannis's flank. Stannis's men fought with grim determination. The swirl of battle kicked up dust clouds, hiding the carnage from the watchers on the city walls. At Tyrion's signal, a portion of the gold cloaks and Lannister men opened the northern gates and charged out. Ned, leading a separate battalion, advanced on foot, the standard of the crown fluttering overhead. They aimed to exploit any thinning of the siege lines. Shouts and war cries filled the air. The ground was scorched and cratered from previous battles, making the going treacherous. They clashed with Stannis's rearguard amid a confusion of noise and smoke. Ned fought shoulder to shoulder with the men, sword rising and falling. Blood spattered across the churned earth. Stannis's soldiers were brave and well-disciplined, but some had already been pulled away to meet Renly's threat, weakening their lines. Soon, the city's defenders gained ground, pressing the rearguard back toward the main battlefield. From glimpses through the dust, Ned saw the scale of the conflict. Two Baratheon armies, once a single house, now torn by rivalry and ambition. The Tyrell roses mingled in the melee, knights in shining armor clashing with men in battered plate. Now and then, a flash of wildfire erupted as Lannister sappers set hidden traps. The screams of horses and men alike rose in a hideous chorus. Overhead, crows circled, waiting for the feast. Ned pushed on, rallying those gold cloaks who wavered. He never wanted to be here, but if fighting this battle could end the siege and spare the city further misery, he had no choice. Tyrion joined them at one point, riding a stocky mount. The dwarf carried a short axe, his face smeared with sweat and grime. They shared a grim nod before Tyrion peeled off to direct another flank. Stannis's lines buckled under the combined assault. Renly's cavalry hammered them from the south. The city's forces pressed from the north. Bit by bit, the ring around King's Landing dissolved. Men fled or died in the dust. Some fought to the last breath. Others cast down weapons and tried to surrender. Amid the chaos, Ned glimpsed a swirl of bright color, knights in Renly's livery. He caught sight of Loras Tyrell skewering a bannerman wearing Stannis's flaming heart. Then the dust swallowed them again. The sun climbed to its zenith. Heat shimmered over the battlefield, intensifying the stench of blood and rot. By mid-afternoon, the outcome was clear. Stannis's once tight siege lines had collapsed. Many of his men had retreated east or fled for the ships. The ground behind them was littered with broken siege towers, shattered catapults, and corpses. Renly's banners flew in triumphant clusters, though at a terrible cost. The City Watch and Lannister troops, battered but victorious, cheered half-heartedly. The day was theirs. King's Landing was free of the siege. Ned stood panting amid the carnage, sword hanging at his side. His limbs ached. His soul weighed down by the brutality he had witnessed. All around him, men tended the wounded or looted the dead. The screams continued. Pools of bright red blood gathered in the low places of the battlefield. This is victory, Ned thought bitterly. This is what we do in the name of kings. A horn sounded from Renly's lines. Slowly, banners advanced toward the city, a sign of parley or alliance. Joffrey's standard-bearers emerged from the gates to greet them. The survivors of Stannis's army vanished into the distance, scattered or sailing away. Whether Stannis himself lived or died remained unknown. Some said they saw him rallying men near the southern flank, then losing them again. Others claimed he boarded a ship, War, as always, shrouded truth in rumor. That evening, Renly Baratheon himself rode up to the Red Keep gates, accompanied by Loras Tyrell, Brienne of Tarth, and a sizable honor guard. He entered the city as a would-be savior, greeted by the battered defenders. Cersei forced a pleasant mask as she welcomed him, praising his timely intervention. Joffrey, though sullen at sharing the stage, thanked him publicly. Feasts were hastily prepared amid the burned ruins and short supplies, a hollow celebration. But the city's populace, half-starved and weary, found some hope in the lifting of the siege. Ned Stark watched from the sidelines as Renly dismounted in the courtyard, clasping hands with Tyrell knights. Then the Pretender King's gaze swept over to Ned. For a moment, Renly's eyes were unreadable, curiosity, or perhaps wariness. Then he turned away, greeting Tyrion with a courteous nod. The pageantry continued. At last, they proceeded into the Great Hall, where Renly was announced as the beloved brother of King Robert, the valiant protector of the realm's southern approach, and other inflated titles. Joffrey stood stiffly, crowning him with a laurel of victory. It was an awkward pantomime of unity. In truth, everyone knew the alliance was tenuous. Renly wanted real power. Joffrey and the Lannisters wanted to keep the throne. The Tyrells wanted influence and wealth. For the moment, none were strong enough to push the other out. So they smiled and clasped arms for the benefit of the cheering crowd. Ned slipped away, heading for the quiet of the Godswood. He trudged across the courtyard, passing piles of broken siege equipment. Some men huddled around fires, roasting meager scraps of meat. The scent of smoke and death lingered. When he reached the Godswood, the hush of leaves offered little solace, but it was better than the Great Hall's false jubilation. He sank to his knees beneath a slender weirwood, its bark pale under the moonlight. No carved face adorned it. Southern Godswoods lacked the true northern tradition. Still, he closed his eyes, letting the hush wash over him. The cost of the siege had been enormous. Thousands dead, the city ravaged. Stannis' dream of the throne was likely ended, for now, but the realm still had Renly, Joffrey, Robb, and the Greyjoys to contend with. The Targaryens, if they existed, might also return. War had only begun to unravel the Seven Kingdoms. Footsteps crunched on the grass behind him. Ned tensed, hand drifting to his sword out of habit. Then a soft voice spoke. "Praying for release, Lord Stark?" It was Tyrion. He approached quietly, head bowed in respect for the Godswood. "I thought you might be here." Ned slowly got to his feet. "Release, yes, or guidance, or forgiveness for living while so many die." Tyrion nodded. "We survived. The city survived. Renly's victory is our victory. For now." Ned's gaze flicked up to the pale branches overhead. "All these alliances and deals, they're as fragile as a spider's web. Another wind and they'll snap. Then more men will die." Tyrion sighed. "I know, but I've spent my life among the powerful in Westeros, and I've learned that compromise is the only bulwark we have against endless slaughter. Even if it's a lie, sometimes the lie can buy time." They stood in silence for a moment, listening to the distant sounds of the city. Cries of wounded men, the crackle of fires, the uneasy shuffle of newly arrived Tyrell soldiers. Ned thought of Catelyn, of Robb, of the North battered by Ironborn. He remembered the moment that might have sparked a different war. Catelyn capturing Tyrion at the inn. Would that have truly changed anything? Perhaps the war over Joffrey's parentage was unstoppable, a deeper fault line always destined to crack. At length, Ned turned to Tyrion, voice low. "What happens now?" "Renly will demand we honor our promises." Handing him near autonomy in the south, a betrothal to Marjorie, seats on the council. Tyrion managed a rueful smile. "We do what we can. We'll negotiate, we'll backstab, and the game continues. For tonight, at least, the city sleeps without the sound of catapults." "That's something." Ned closed his eyes. He could still see the images of the battlefield, the crows circling overhead. Peace for one night, and tomorrow we awaken to 1,000 new intrigues. And somewhere out there, My son fights your father. My wife stands guard over Winterfell, and the Greyjoys raid the western coasts. Tyrion exhaled softly. Welcome to the endgame, Lord Stark, though I fear we're only in the middle of it. The War of the Five Kings, they'll call it, or something like that. All because the lines of succession were overshadowed by secrets, incest, ambition, and every petty feud in the realm. Ned's lips thinned. It's a monstrous puzzle, and in the midst of it, the people suffer. My father used to say that when the swords clash, it's the small folk who bleed first. He was right. They walked in silence through the Godswood, each lost in thoughts of sorrow and relief. The siege had ended, but the war raged on. By not capturing Tyrion that day at the Crossroads Inn, Catelyn had averted a more immediate Stark-Lannister feud, but the realm's greater cracks had split open regardless. The swirl of succession, the force of ambition, these forces dwarfed any single dagger. They would shape the fate of Westeros for years to come. In the moonlit stillness, Ned found Tyrion's eyes on him. The imp spoke with uncharacteristic gentleness. I won't claim to be your friend, Lord Stark, but I find I respect you. If ever the day comes that we can put these wars behind us, I'd like to share a cup of wine in a more peaceful time. Ned allowed himself a faint smile. If that day ever comes, you have my word. I'll drink to the realm's peace. They parted ways then, Tyrion returning to his new duties as the uneasy caretaker of Joffrey's rule. Ned heading back to his solar, uncertain how to guide a kingdom in which he had never wished to remain. The sky overhead was brilliant with stars, but no comfort came from their distant sparkle. The city was safe tonight, but many challenges lurked beyond the battered walls. And though the seeds of war had blossomed without the spark that once seemed so pivotal, there was no guarantee that any of them would live to see those seeds uprooted. In the following days, Renly consolidated his position as the city's co-protector, effectively overshadowing the battered gold cloaks. Loras Tyrell and other knights stood guard in key posts, supplanting many Lannister men. Cersei fumed but could not openly oppose them. Joffrey tried to maintain regal composure, but he was overshadowed by the tall and charismatic Renly, who charmed courtiers at feasts and boasted of future glories. The Tyrell alliance demanded immediate boons. Shipments of food from Highgarden were to be distributed first to their own troops and then to the city, ensuring the Tyrells were seen as saviors by the starving populace. The people cheered for Renly in the streets, praising him as the king who fed us, even though Joffrey still claimed the Iron Throne. Tensions simmered, but for the moment, neither side was ready to break the alliance. Ned Stark watched these developments from a careful distance. He was allowed more freedom now that the siege was lifted and the Tyrells had a say in city governance. But he found no real power in it, only a chance to see how quickly alliances shifted. Tyrion remained at the center of the webs, parleying with Renly's advisors, conferring with Varys, fending off Baelish's intrigues, and trying to keep Joffrey from making rash decisions. The city slowly recovered, removing rubble, burying the dead, cleaning the charred remains of siege weapons from outside the gates. Hope flickered among the small folk, though no one dared believe it would last. Meanwhile, ravens confirmed that Tywin Lannister had retreated westward, harried by Robb Stark and Edmure Tully. Harrenhal was in disarray. Jaime Lannister remained with Tywin, forging a new plan to crush the northern host. In the north itself, Balon Greyjoy had indeed crowned himself king of the Isles and the North, launching brutal raids that forced loyal Stark bannermen to defend their coasts. Catelyn was said to be negotiating alliances with the Crannogmen to hold the neck. The entire realm sprawled with conflict. Daenerys Targaryen's name popped up in occasional whispers. Some said she had dragons, others scoffed at the notion. No one in the capital had resources or will to heed such rumors while the mainland was still in turmoil. One morning, Ned received a raven from Robb at last. The message was brief and formal, acknowledging receipt of Ned's earlier letter. Robb wrote that he was leading the northern host with the Tully alliance, binding their fates in shared cause. He wrote of victories over some Lannister detachments, of the crossing at the Twins, of the cunning counsel from his mother, and of the burdens of leadership. Nowhere did Robb mention turning back. Instead, He spoke of driving the Lannisters out of the Riverlands and securing an advantageous position to negotiate for Ned's release. Ned read those words, a pang in his chest, realizing Robb still believed him effectively a prisoner. In truth, he was not free, but neither was he behind bars. The city's politics made illusions of freedom as real as chains. Ned penned a reply urging caution, warning of the Greyjoy threat, and stating that the city was currently in stable alliance with Renly Baratheon, but that the future was uncertain. He tried to convey how complicated the situation had become, but the letter could only do so much. He ended with fatherly pride. No matter how far these wars take us, know that I am proud of you, my son. May the gods guide you and keep you. Then he sent the raven, praying it would reach Robb swiftly. That day, Tyrion and Ned walked the ramparts together, gazing at the southwestern horizon where the Tyrell banners had set up an impressive camp. Renly boasted tens of thousands of men, many from the Reach, others from the Stormlands. A new seat of power just outside King's Landing. Tyrion shook his head in mild awe. I never thought I'd see Tyrells occupying the same ground we fought to keep from Stannis. Strange how war flips alliances so quickly. Ned's eyes scanned the rolling fields. This city has new masters every other week, it seems. Tyrion snorted. Not quite masters. Renly fancies himself a king, but he's biding his time. One day he might press a stronger claim on the throne. Joffrey is young, and not half as loved by the people. In a few years, Renly might engineer a reason to seize power. Or if Tywin returns victorious, we might see a different shift. The game never ends. Silence fell between them, a sense of weariness binding them in unspoken camaraderie. Neither had asked for this war, but both were deeply enmeshed. The realm was a puzzle with too many pieces missing. Ned wondered if the next generation, his children, if they survived, would inherit a broken kingdom riddled with bitterness. He prayed it would not be so. At length Tyrion cleared his throat. Lord Stark, if the day ever comes when your son or your house demands satisfaction for the injustices done to you, I hope you remember that I, at least, tried to keep the realm from tearing itself apart. Ned looked at the dwarf, considering. I remember. None of us are blameless, but you did strive to avoid the worst. That is more than many can say. Tyrion gave a small bow, oddly formal. Then perhaps, in some small way, we've changed the course of events. Maybe we can still steer things away from total ruin. They gazed out once more at the battered fields, the ash-laden moats, the fledgling tents of the Tyrell encampment. A gust of wind carried the odor of burnt wood, rotting flesh, and the faintest scent of summer flowers from the far meadows. The mix was jarring, like the realm itself, caught between death and life, war and the hope of renewal. In time, Ned turned to go. Tyrion accompanied him. The rampart steps descended into the courtyard, where new conscripts and old veterans mingled. King's Landing might see a tenuous peace in the coming weeks, or it might see a new storm if Renly and Joffrey could not keep their alliance. The wheels of war kept turning. Even so, for that moment the city was not under siege, and the people breathed a little easier. That evening, in the half-ruined Tower of the Hand, Ned Stark sat down with quill and parchment one more time. He began a letter to Catelyn. He wrote of the horrors of the siege, how Renly had lifted it, how Tyrion had played a crucial role in preventing an earlier bloodbath. He explained the fragile alliance now in place, the uncertain future. He spoke of missing Winterfell's sturdy walls, yearning for the presence of his family, for the simpler days before the court called them south. At last, he paused, the candle's flame flickering in the warm air. In a sense, everything had begun with that choice at the Crossroads Inn. Catelyn, confronted by Tyrion, had chosen not to seize him. Or perhaps it had begun when Bran fell from the tower, or even earlier still, with Robert's rebellion and all the hidden seeds of ambition. The truth was that no one event wholly shaped the realm's fate. 1,000 threads intertwined. Yet the memory of that single choice lingered as a reminder that mercy can stay certain hands, though it cannot always halt the tide of greater wars. With a heavy heart, Ned penned his final lines to Catelyn. I know not what the future holds, but I pray we have done some small good amid the chaos. Perhaps your moment of forbearance at the inn spared the North and the West from igniting into war too soon, though the realm now faces a broader conflict for the throne. We must endure. I swear to you, by the old gods and the new, that I will strive toward peace for our children's sake, for all the children of Westeros. If the gods are kind, one day this land might know unity again. Your loving husband, Eddard. He sealed the letter. Outside the window, the moon hung low, and the city slept in uneasy calm. Another day would bring more intrigue, more alliances, more battles perhaps. But for now, the war's thunder had softened to a distant rumble. In that stillness, Ned whispered a silent prayer to the old gods, remembering Winterfell's heart tree. He pictured his children, Robb, Sansa, Arya, Bran, Rickon. He prayed they might live to see a realm where justice and honor prevailed, not just the ambition of kings. And far away, on roads that wound north and east and west, ravens flew in the night, bearing tidings of the siege's end, messages of war and alliances, of false kings and half-truths. Across rivers and mountains, over forests and seas, the realm's lords stirred, each with their own designs. No matter how the lines were drawn, it seemed peace was a distant dream. Yet in the hearts of a few, Catelyn's quiet mercy, Tyrion's reluctant diplomacy, Ned's unwavering sense of duty, small sparks of hope endured. Perhaps these sparks would one day light a candle in the darkness, guiding Westeros toward a kinder fate. Or perhaps the storm of war would snuff them out. Only the gods and the winding paths of the future could say for certain. Still, for this night, the siege was broken. King's Landing did not burn, and that was enough. Ned Stark set down his quill and closed his eyes, letting himself imagine, for just a moment, that the realm might yet find a path beyond the shadow of war. If a single choice at a humble inn could shift the currents of fate, then perhaps other choices, shaped by mercy and honor, might steer Westeros away from the worst of its nightmares. It was a thin hope, but hope all the same. And as Ned finally found a fitful sleep, that hope flickered in the darkness like the last candle standing in a hall of ruin, refusing to be extinguished.